He walked out of that Chicago courtroom with a grin so wide it practically split his face. My husband was absolutely convinced he had just taken my house, my money, and my dignity. He thought he had left me with nothing but the clothes on my back. But when the reality of those signed papers finally hit him, it would tear his entire world apart. Because I am not just a heartbroken wife, I am a forensic accountant, and I planned every single step of his destruction. The heavy wooden gavel struck the sounding block with a sharp crack that echoed through the high-vaulted ceilings of the Cook County courtroom. Dust motes danced in the shafts of pale afternoon sunlight, filtering through the tall windows, indifferent to the absolute destruction of my 10-year marriage. I flinched at the sound of the wood hitting wood, letting my shoulders slump forward, deliberately burying my face in my trembling hands. To the judge, the bailiff, and the casual observer, I was the perfect picture of a defeated woman. I was the discarded, aging wife weeping uncontrollably as the cold legal system stripped her bare and handed her life over to a younger replacement. The judge adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses, reading the final terms of the divorce settlement in a dry, monotonous drone that made my skin crawl. He formally awarded Julian the primary estate in the prestigious Gold Coast neighborhood, the 3 luxury vehicles, and total uncontested ownership of Vertex Solutions. That was the $10 million tech startup Julian loudly claimed he built from the ground up with his own bare hands, his sweat, and his visionary genius. Sitting just 2 rows behind Julian in the gallery was Madison. She was 24 years old, a former marketing intern who now wore a custom-tailored tweed suit paid for entirely by my joint checking account. I could hear her perfectly manicured acrylic nails tapping a restless, excited rhythm against the solid oak pew. She leaned forward, her heavy, suffocatingly sweet floral perfume wafting over the sterile, paper-scented air of the courtroom. She whispered to her friend, but she made sure it was loud enough for me to hear every single word. Look at her crying like a pathetic loser. She should have known a real man needs a real woman by his side, not a tired old workhorse who cannot even give him children. I let a loud, ragged sob escape my throat, burying my face deeper into my hands to hide the fact that there were absolutely no tears in my eyes. The truth was, I felt nothing but a cold surgical precision. Julian honestly believed he was the mastermind behind Vertex Solutions. He was a charismatic, smooth-talking salesman, I will give him that. But a salesman does not build a $10 million corporate infrastructure. I did that. I liquidated my own maternal grandfather's trust fund 5 years ago to seed the initial operating capital when no bank would even look at him. I spent countless grueling nights drafting the complex financial architecture, navigating the maze of federal tax codes, and securing the ironclad vendor contracts, while Julian was out at expensive steakhouses, supposedly networking with investors. I was the ghost in the machine, the silent architect of his entire reality. As a certified forensic accountant, I knew exactly how money moved, how it could be hidden, and how it could be weaponized. Julian thought my quiet late nights staring at glowing spreadsheets meant I was just a boring submissive housewife managing the household grocery budget. He never once realized I was mastering the art of financial warfare right under his nose. The judge looked up from his thick stack of folders and asked if the plaintiff understood and agreed to the final terms. Julian stood up abruptly, proudly buttoning his custom Italian suit jacket. "Yes, Your Honor," he said, his voice dripping with faux humility and practiced charm. "I just want to move on and build a positive, healthy future. I want to thank the court for recognizing my hard work and personal sacrifice in growing this company. It has been a difficult season, but justice has finally been served today." I bit the inside of my cheek so hard, I tasted copper, desperate to keep from laughing out loud at his sheer audacity. His hard work. It was a laughable, sickening concept. Over the last 2 years, I had quietly watched him siphon company funds to pay for Madison's luxury downtown apartment, her lavish vacations to Cabo San Lucas, and her diamond tennis bracelets. I tracked every single fraudulent expense, every forged receipt, every hidden wire transfer across state lines. I let him do it. I let him dig a hole so incredibly deep the bottom was practically in another dimension. By ruthlessly fighting for total ownership of the company in this divorce, Julian was legally demanding to take full, undivided responsibility for a massive mountain of financial crimes he did not even realize he had committed on paper. The bailiff walked over his heavy boots, echoing loudly on the polished marble floor. He handed the thick stack of settlement papers to Julian. Julian took the expensive silver fountain pen from his breast pocket. He did not even bother to read the final pages or consult his attorney one last time. He just flipped straight to the back, his eyes gleaming with raw, greedy anticipation, and signed his name with a dramatic, sweeping flourish. He looked over at me, a smug, victorious smirk playing heavily on his lips. He thought he was looking at a woman who had lost everything she ever loved. He had no idea he was looking at the architect of his impending federal prison sentence. The bailiff then brought the heavy documents over to my table. My lawyer, a brilliant, quiet man who was entirely in on my actual plan, gave me a subtle, reassuring nod. I picked up the pen with a deliberately shaking hand. I let one single, perfectly timed fake tear fall from my eyes, splashing right onto the thick parchment paper next to the signature line. I sniffled loudly, putting on the absolute final act of the tragedy, and slowly signed my name, Victoria. The moment the tip of my pen lifted from the paper, the trembling stopped entirely. The illusion vanished into thin air. My spine straightened like a steel rod. I lowered my hands from my face and looked directly into Julian's eyes across the aisle. The pathetic, weeping housewife was gone forever. I smiled at him. It was not a sad, broken smile. It was a chilling, predatory grin that reached all the way to my cold, calculating eyes. Julian's arrogant smirk faltered for a fraction of a second. A brief flash of deep confusion crossed his handsome face. He did not understand why the wounded prey was suddenly looking at the hunter with such absolute terrifying amusement. The judge struck the heavy gavel one final time, a loud crack that sealed Julian's fate, declaring the proceedings adjourned and the marriage officially dissolved. Julian turned away, quickly adjusting his tie, eager to escape and celebrate his massive victory with his young mistress. But the trap was already sprung. The company he just fought so viciously to steal was a hollow shell, heavily tethered to a devastating IRS audit I had carefully engineered. He thought he had just won the gold mine. He had actually just signed the legal deed to his own financial graveyard. The heavy oak doors of the courtroom closed behind me with a resounding thud that echoed through the cavernous marble lobby of the Chicago courthouse. The air out here felt completely different from the sterile and oppressive atmosphere inside the courtroom. It was cooler and smelled faintly of floor wax and old paper. I took a slow and deliberate breath, letting the facade of the weeping and discarded wife wash away from my features. My posture straightened. The trembling in my hands vanished instantly, replaced by the steady and absolute calm of a woman who had just successfully executed the most critical phase of a massive financial operation. My heels clicked rhythmically against the polished stone floor, each step a testament to the ironclad trap I had just laid out for the man who thought he had broken me. I did not make it more than 50 feet toward the grand exit before the loud and unmistakable pop of a cork shattered the quiet dignity of the courthouse hall. The sound was followed immediately by a chorus of obnoxious and high-pitched laughter. I slowed my pace and turned my head slightly to the left. There they were. Julian and Madison had positioned themselves right in the middle of the main thoroughfare, making absolutely sure I would have to walk directly past them to leave the building. Julian was holding a bottle of expensive French champagne, the kind we used to open on our wedding anniversaries, back when I still believed his lies. The foaming golden liquid was spilling over the green glass neck and splashing onto the pristine floor. Madison was clinging tightly to his arm, holding out a pair of crystal flutes she had actually brought with her in her oversized designer tote bag. They were throwing a literal victory party right outside the courtroom doors. I kept my eyes fixed straight ahead, intending to walk past them like they were nothing more than ghosts. But Madison was not going to let her moment of perceived triumph slip away so easily. She deliberately stepped directly into my path, completely blocking my way to the heavy revolving doors. Julian followed right behind her, a smug and arrogant grin plastered across his handsome face. Before I could even attempt to step around them, Madison dramatically thrust her hand forward, pretending to lose her balance in her impossibly high stilettos. She tipped her crystal flute forward intentionally, sending a wide arc of sticky and bubbling champagne directly onto the front of my tailored gray suit. The cold liquid hit my chest and instantly soaked through the fine wool fabric, spreading into an ugly and dark stain that clung uncomfortably to my skin. The sharp smell of fermented grapes and alcohol overwhelmed my senses. I stopped dead in my tracks. I looked down at the ruined fabric of my jacket and then slowly raised my eyes to meet hers. I did not gasp. I did not scream or raise my hand to strike her. I simply stood there with the absolute stillness of a predator watching a severely injured animal thrash around in the dirt. "Oh my gosh, I am so incredibly sorry," Madison said, her voice dripping with thick and undisguised sarcasm. She covered her mouth with her manicured hand, letting out a sharp and mocking giggle that echoed off the high marble walls. "I guess I am just so overwhelmed with happiness that I completely lost my footing. But do not worry too much about it, Victoria. It looks like a cheap, off-the-rack polyester suit anyway. You can probably just throw it in the washing machine at that depressing little apartment you are moving into. Or better yet, maybe you can finally afford to buy something from this decade with whatever pathetic alimony the judge let you scrape together." Julian stepped up beside her, wrapping his arm securely around her waist and pulling her close. He looked at the massive stain on my chest and let out a low and cruel chuckle. "Leave her alone," Madison Julian said, though his tone made it entirely clear he was enjoying every single second of my humiliation. "She has had a really tough day. It is not easy watching a real visionary take back control of his empire. You should go home, Victoria. Go home and try to figure out what you are going to do with the rest of your empty life. Vertex Solutions is mine now. The Gold Coast estate is mine. It is time for you to finally accept that you are just a temporary stepping stone on my path to real greatness." He took a long sip directly from the champagne bottle, his eyes locked onto mine, waiting eagerly for the explosion. He wanted me to scream at him. He wanted me to cry and beg and cause a massive scene in the middle of the courthouse lobby so he could easily point his finger and show the world exactly how crazy and unstable his ex-wife truly was. He wanted the satisfaction of watching me break down in public. Instead, I offered him a completely serene and pleasant smile. I reached my hand slowly into my genuine Italian leather briefcase. I bypassed the folders of useless court documents and pulled out a single thick white envelope. It was sealed with heavy wax and completely unmarked on the outside. I held it out toward him, keeping my hand perfectly level and steady. "What is this?" Julian asked, his arrogant smile faltering for just a fraction of a second. He looked down at the pristine white envelope and then back up at my calm face. "Is this some kind of desperate apology letter? Are you seriously trying to beg me to take you back after everything that just happened in there? Because if you are wasting your time and embarrassing yourself even more. Just open it, Julian." I said, my voice barely above a whisper, yet carrying a weight that made the air around us feel suddenly dense and suffocating. "Consider it my final and most sincere parting gift to you. A small token of my deep appreciation for everything you have shown me today." Julian scoffed loudly, rolling his eyes as he snatched the envelope roughly from my hand. He confidently broke the wax seal with his thumb, completely convinced he was about to read a pathetic and desperate confession of my undying love. Madison leaned over his shoulder, a vicious and hungry look in her eyes, eager to read whatever humiliating words she thought I had written to the man she had stolen from me. Julian pulled the heavy stack of folded papers from the envelope and violently snapped them open. The smug and victorious grin on his face was permanently etched into his features for exactly 3 seconds as his eyes scanned the bold and terrifying black letters printed across the top of the very first page. Then right before my eyes, the absolute destruction of his reality began to unfold. The document he was holding was not a letter from a heartbroken wife. It was a formal, expedited, and deeply aggressive notice from the Internal Revenue Service. Specifically, it was a high-priority audit and immediate asset freeze declaration issued directly by the Federal Criminal Tax Division. The bold text clearly outlined a devastating and inescapable offshore tax liability amounting to over $4 million in unpaid penalties and intentional corporate fraud. And the most beautiful and brilliant part of the entire document was the name of the entity solely responsible for the massive and crushing debt. The liability was permanently and legally attached directly to the primary operating LLC of Vertex Solutions. I watched in absolute silence as the blood drained completely from Julian's face. His tan and healthy complexion turned a sickly and pale shade of gray in a matter of seconds. The hand holding the federal tax notice began to shake so violently that the thick paper rattled loudly in the quiet lobby. His eyes darted frantically back and forth across the page, desperately searching for a mistake, a typo, or any sign that this was just some kind of elaborate and sick joke. But the official government seals and the heavily detailed breakdown of his own hidden accounts told him the absolute and terrifying truth. "What is this?" Julian whispered, his voice cracking and breaking under the sudden and crushing weight of panic. He looked up at me, his eyes wide with a raw and unfiltered terror that I had never seen before. "What did you do, Victoria? What is this garbage? This says Vertex Solutions owes $4 million in offshore penalties. This says the primary owner is personally liable for immediate federal collection." I smiled again, stepping slightly closer to him so he could hear exactly how steady and unaffected my voice was. "That is absolutely correct, Julian. You see, while you were so busy funneling the company revenue into hidden accounts in the Cayman Islands to pay for Madison's ridiculous lifestyle, you fundamentally misunderstood how corporate tax law actually works. I did not just let you steal that money. I intentionally drafted the transfer authorizations to trigger an automatic federal flag the second a change in primary ownership was legally finalized. Madison looked confused, her eyes darting between Julian and the terrifying papers in his shaking hand. "Julian, what is she talking about?" Madison asked, her high-pitched voice dropping into a tone of genuine concern. "What does that mean? What is she saying?" "It means," I said, shifting my gaze to look directly into Madison's perfectly made-up face, "that the $10 million company your boyfriend just fought tooth and nail to win in this divorce is actually a massive and sinking ship. The federal government is moving to seize everything he owns to cover the fraudulent debt. And because the judge just granted Julian total and uncontested ownership of the company less than 10 minutes ago, he also legally inherited 100% of the criminal tax liability. I am completely clear and free. He took the whole entire burden right off my shoulders." The heavy and expensive bottle of French champagne suddenly slipped from Julian's numb fingers. It hit the hard marble floor with a deafening crash, shattering into 1,000 glittering green pieces. The remaining golden liquid exploded across the floor, soaking into the cuffs of his custom Italian trousers and splashing onto Madison's expensive stilettos. But Julian did not even notice the mess. He was completely paralyzed, staring at the IRS notice, as if he were holding a live explosive that was just seconds away from taking his life. "You set me up." Julian choked out the reality of his massive and fatal mistake, finally crushing his lungs. "You knew this was coming. You gave me the company on purpose. You wanted me to take it so the federal agents would come after me instead of you. I never forced you to take anything, Julian. I simply stepped back and allowed your own monumental greed to do all of the heavy lifting for me. You wanted everything, and now you finally have it. Enjoy the victory party. I hear federal prison is really beautiful this time of year." I turned my back on them without waiting for another pathetic word. I did not look back as I walked straight through the heavy glass doors and out into the warm and bright Chicago afternoon. I left Julian standing frozen in the middle of a shattered puddle of champagne, holding the exact legal documents that would systematically destroy the rest of his miserable life. The stain on my suit jacket was still damp, but I had never felt cleaner or more powerful in my entire existence. The first trap had officially snapped shut, and I was just getting started. I watched the high-definition live security feed on my encrypted tablet from the absolute safety and comfort of my private car parked 3 blocks away. I knew exactly what Julian was doing right at this very second. He was tearing frantically through the busy and congested streets of downtown Chicago, driving his expensive imported sports car with reckless and desperate abandon. The crushing weight of the federal tax notice I had just handed him in the courthouse lobby was acting like a lethal venom spreading rapidly through his veins. He was in a state of absolute and blinding panic. His entire false reality had just collapsed on top of him, and he was operating on pure adrenaline. He was speeding back to our Gold Coast penthouse with 2 very specific and urgent goals burning violently in his mind. First, he wanted to physically drag me out of the apartment by my hair. He wanted to exercise the ultimate legal authority the judge had just granted him. He wanted to watch me cry and beg as he threw me out onto the cold street with nothing but a single pathetic suitcase. He wanted to reassert his dominance. Second, and far more importantly, he needed to secure his hidden wall safe before the federal agents could seize the property. That safe was buried deep inside the drywall of his private study, completely hidden behind a massive custom-built mahogany bookshelf. Julian genuinely thought he was a criminal mastermind. He honestly believed that safe was completely undetectable to the outside world. Inside that heavy reinforced steel box was a physical leather-bound ledger detailing every single fraudulent transaction he had made over the last 2 years. It also contained a highly encrypted solid-state hard drive holding the core proprietary source code for Vertex Solutions. In his frantic and terrified mind, Julian believed that if he could just grab that hard drive and that ledger, he could somehow liquidate whatever assets were left and flee the country before the federal government could freeze his domestic accounts. He was a cornered and desperate rat, relying entirely on sheer animal instinct. The camera feed on my tablet switched automatically to the private elevator lobby on the penthouse floor. The polished brass doors slid open violently, and Julian practically stumbled out into the hallway. His breathing was heavy and ragged. His custom-tailored suit jacket was severely wrinkled and completely disheveled. The dark, wet stain from the champagne Madison had spilled on me earlier was still highly visible on his sleeve, serving as a pathetic and ironic reminder of his incredibly short-lived victory. He marched aggressively up to the heavy double-oak doors of the penthouse and angrily punched his security code into the digital keypad. He shoved the doors open with his shoulder, bracing himself for a massive, screaming match. He fully expected to find me sitting in the middle of the living room, weeping helplessly over my ruined life. Instead, Julian stepped into a massive and echoing void. The entire 5,000-square-foot luxury penthouse was completely and utterly empty. The enormous custom velvet sectional sofa was gone. The imported Persian rugs that cost more than a small suburban house had been rolled up and removed. The expensive, abstract paintings he had purchased solely to impress his shallow and pretentious investor friends were stripped from the walls, leaving behind only faint, rectangular shadows on the pristine white paint. The massive floor-to-ceiling windows offered a breathtaking panoramic view of the Chicago skyline and the glittering blue waters of Lake Michigan. But inside the apartment, there was absolutely nothing but vast open space. Julian stopped dead in his tracks. The silence in the room was absolute and suffocating. I could see the profound and terrifying confusion washing over his handsome face on the high-resolution monitor. He blinked several times, trying desperately to process the impossible sight before him. It was as if the entire physical history of our 10-year marriage had been magically erased from existence in a matter of hours. A new wave of intense panic suddenly hit him. He abandoned the living room and broke into a full sprint toward his private study. His leather dress shoes slapped loudly against the bare hardwood floors, echoing like gunshots through the empty apartment. He burst through the study doors and let out a loud, strangled gasp of absolute horror. The custom mahogany bookshelf had not just been moved out of the way, it had been completely dismantled and destroyed. Pieces of splintered wood were scattered carelessly across the floor, and the hidden wall safe was entirely gone. It had not been cracked open or drilled into, it had been surgically cut straight out of the drywall. All that remained was a gaping, jagged hole filled with pink fiberglass insulation and exposed copper wiring. Everything he had hidden away from the world, every single dark secret he thought he was protecting, was gone. Julian staggered backward into the main living area, his hands pulling frantically at his hair. He was hyperventilating, his chest heaving rapidly as the reality of his situation began to completely fracture his sanity. That was when a deep, calm, and incredibly steady voice echoed from the far side of the massive room. "You are looking in the wrong place, Julian." Julian spun around so fast he nearly lost his footing on the slick hardwood. Standing perfectly still in the very center of the expansive living room was Marcus. Marcus is my younger sister's husband. He is a brilliant, highly respected African-American man who owns and operates one of the most elite and ruthless cybersecurity auditing firms in the entire country. Marcus was dressed impeccably in a dark charcoal-tailored suit. His posture was completely relaxed, but his physical presence commanded the entire room. He looked at Julian with an expression of mild amusement mixed with absolute undisguised disgust. Marcus held his right hand up to his chest. Resting casually in his broad palm was the thick black metallic casing of Julian's highly encrypted solid-state hard drive. It was the exact drive Julian had just risked a massive speeding ticket to secure. Marcus casually tossed the heavy drive into the air and caught it effortlessly. He repeated the motion, tossing it up and catching it in a slow, rhythmic and taunting cadence that made Julian's eyes bulge out of his head. "What are you doing in my house?" Julian screamed, his voice cracking with sheer panic and rage. "How did you get in here? Give me that drive right now, Marcus. That is my personal property. You are trespassing, and I will call the police and have you arrested immediately." Marcus let out a low, deep chuckle. He stopped tossing the drive and slipped it smoothly into the inside pocket of his suit jacket. "You cannot call the police to report a trespasser in an apartment you no longer own, Julian. And you certainly do not want to involve the authorities when you are currently running from a massive federal tax evasion warrant. By the way, your encryption security is an absolute joke. You used a commercial software package thinking it made you a ghost. It took my team exactly 14 seconds to break your master password. Your password was Madison's birth year, followed by an exclamation point. It was a genuine insult to my profession." Julian took a threatening step forward, his fists clenched tightly at his sides. "What are you talking about? I own this penthouse. The judge awarded it to me less than an hour ago. Now give me my hard drive before I break your jaw." Marcus did not even flinch. He simply reached into his other pocket and pulled out a single folded piece of thick legal paper. He held it up between his index and middle fingers. "Victoria did not just pack her bags and move out this morning, Julian. She legally dissolved every single asset attached to the parent company of Vertex Solutions 3 weeks ago. This luxury penthouse was liquidated and sold to an anonymous holding company yesterday afternoon. The funds were completely untraceable within 10 minutes of the wire transfer." Julian's face contorted in total disbelief. "That is impossible," he shouted. "She cannot legally do that. I am the founder and primary shareholder. My signature is strictly required to authorize the sale of any corporate asset or piece of property. I never signed anything. I will take her back to court and have her thrown in federal prison for fraud." Marcus shook his head slowly, a look of genuine pity crossing his features. "You really are incredibly stupid, Julian. You honestly thought you were the smartest man in the room simply because Victoria generously allowed you to believe it. Do you remember last month when you told Victoria you had to fly to Miami for an emergency investor conference? The same weekend you actually spent on a chartered private yacht with your young intern, Madison." Julian froze, the color draining entirely from his face once again. "Before you left for that trip," Marcus continued, his voice sharp and unrelenting, "Victoria handed you a massive stack of routine vendor contracts to sign. She told you it was just standard quarterly paperwork for the server maintenance teams. You were in such a desperate hurry to get to the airport to see your little girlfriend that you did not even bother to read a single page. You just flipped to the back of every document and blindly signed your name over and over again without a second thought." Julian stared at Marcus, his breathing completely suspended in his chest. "One of those documents," Marcus said, his voice dropping to a cold and lethal register, "was an absolute and irrevocable power of attorney. You legally granted Victoria total unchecked control over every single financial decision, corporate asset, and subsidiary holding attached to your name and your company. You literally gave her the keys to your entire kingdom so you could go drink cheap margaritas on a rented boat." "No," Julian whispered, taking another step back, his legs trembling uncontrollably. "No, she would not do that. The judge just gave me the company. The judge said it is mine. The judge gave you an empty shell, Julian." Marcus took a slow, deliberate step toward the broken man. "Vertex Solutions does not exist anymore. Victoria legally transferred the patents, the operating capital, and the client contracts into a completely new corporate structure that she solely owns and operates. She left the original shell company completely hollow, and the only thing left inside that hollow shell is the $4 million federal tax liability you intentionally created. You fought tooth and nail in federal court to win total ownership of a massive bomb, and then you happily signed the receipt." The absolute gravity of his situation finally crashed down heavily on Julian's shoulders. The $10 million company was gone. The luxury penthouse was gone. The hidden offshore money was gone. His precious source code was sitting in the pocket of an elite cybersecurity expert who had undoubtedly already copied every single file. He had absolutely nothing left. He had spent years treating me like a naive and submissive fool, never once realizing that I was quietly and methodically wiring his entire life with financial explosives. A primal and animalistic scream erupted from Julian's throat. His mind completely snapped under the crushing weight of his monumental failure. All logic and reason abandoned him instantly. In a blind and furious rage, Julian lunged across the empty room toward Marcus. He threw a wild, reckless punch, aiming directly for Marcus's face, desperately trying to reclaim some tiny, pathetic shred of his shattered masculinity. It was a pathetic and humiliating mistake. Marcus did not even break a sweat. With the effortless precision of a man who trained daily, Marcus simply stepped to the side, avoiding the clumsy strike entirely. He reached out and grabbed Julian's extended arm, twisting it sharply behind Julian's back, while simultaneously kicking his leg out from under him with a swift and brutal motion. Julian slammed face first into the hard, bare wooden floor with a sickening thud. All the breath was knocked out of his lungs in a violent rush of air. Before he could even attempt to struggle or fight back, Marcus placed a heavy polished dress shoe firmly against the back of Julian's neck, pinning him completely to the ground like a helpless and pathetic insect. Julian's cheek was pressed painfully against the cold wood. He gasped for air, his expensive suit now covered in floor dust. He tried to thrash around, but Marcus applied just enough downward pressure to make him freeze in agonizing pain. "You need to listen to me very carefully right now," Marcus said, his voice echoing ominously through the empty penthouse. "You are currently trespassing on private property owned by my client's holding company. I could break your arm right now, and the police would simply thank me for restraining a wanted federal tax fugitive. But Victoria does not want you broken physically. She wants you to experience exactly what it feels like to have absolutely nothing." Marcus slowly lifted his foot and stepped back, adjusting his suit jacket as if he had just brushed off a minor annoyance. He looked down at Julian, who was coughing heavily and struggling to push himself up onto his hands and knees. "You have exactly 10 minutes to drag yourself out of this building," Marcus said, checking the expensive silver watch on his wrist. "Because in 11 minutes, the private armed security team I hired will arrive to secure the premises. And if they find you here, they will not be nearly as polite as I was. Run, Julian. Run while you still can. Because Victoria is just getting started, and there is absolutely nowhere left for you to hide." I watched the entire brutal exchange on my tablet, a deep and profound sense of absolute satisfaction washing over me. Julian slowly dragged himself off the floor, his face bright red with shame, fury, and sheer terror. He shot one last panicked and hateful glare at Marcus, before turning and sprinting out of the empty penthouse, fleeing like a terrified animal into the hallway. The illusion of his victory was dead and buried forever. Now it was time to watch him desperately try to survive the fallout. Julian stumbled out of the high-rise apartment building and practically threw himself into the driver's seat of his sports car. His hands were shaking so violently he could barely press the push-to-start button. His mind was a frantic blur of sheer terror and desperation. The federal agents were coming. Marcus had his encrypted hard drive. The penthouse was gone. But Julian still had one final desperate lifeline. He had exactly $2.4 million in liquid cash sitting in a joint wealth management account at his private bank in the financial district. If he could just wire that money directly into Madison's personal checking account, he could drain it later, grab her, and get on a private flight out of the country before the IRS asset freeze officially hit the banking networks. He slammed his foot on the gas pedal, weaving recklessly through the busy Chicago traffic, ignoring red lights and blaring car horns. He arrived at the imposing marble facade of the bank tires, screeching against the curb. He did not even bother to feed the parking meter. He sprinted through the heavy glass doors, bypassing the regular line and marching straight up to the private wealth management desk. The teller was a young woman in a crisp navy blazer. She smiled politely as Julian slammed his platinum debit card onto the polished mahogany counter. "I need an immediate domestic wire transfer," Julian demanded, his voice strained and breathless. "The entire liquid balance. Send it all to the routing number I have on file under Madison Reynolds. Do it right now." The teller blinked, looking slightly taken aback by his aggressive tone and disheveled appearance. Of course, sir, let me pull up your portfolio, she said, her fingers flying across the mechanical keyboard. Julian stood there, wiping cold sweat from his forehead, tapping his foot frantically against the marble floor. Every single second felt like an agonizing hour. He kept looking over his shoulder, half expecting to see federal agents storming through the bank doors. The teller stared at her monitor, her polite smile slowly fading into a look of genuine confusion. Sir, I am getting an error code on this request, she said, her brow furrowing. It says the funds are currently unavailable for transfer. Julian slammed his fist against the counter, making the teller jump. What do you mean, unavailable? He shouted, drawing the attention of a security guard standing near the entrance. It is liquid cash. There is over $2 million in that account. Override the error and send the wire. I am the primary account holder. The teller typed nervously, her eyes darting between her screen and Julian's flushed, angry face. Sir, I cannot override this, she said, her voice trembling slightly. The funds are not just locked. They are actively being routed out of the institution as we speak. Julian's heart completely stopped in his chest. He shoved his hand into his pocket and pulled out his smartphone, his thumb slipping against the screen as he desperately logged into his mobile banking app. The facial recognition scanned his terrified features, and the main dashboard loaded. He stared at the screen, his breath catching in his throat. The digital numbers were literally moving. Right before his eyes, a massive pending transfer of $2.4 million changed from yellow to green, indicating the transaction had successfully cleared. The balance on his primary wealth management account instantly dropped from 7 digits to a single terrifying 0. He frantically tapped on his secondary checking account. 0. He opened his offshore routing ledger. 0. Every single account attached to his name, his social security number, and his corporate identity had been completely and surgically drained. He was standing in the middle of one of the wealthiest banks in Chicago, holding a platinum card that was now completely worthless. The security guard took a slow step forward, his hand resting on his radio. Sir, is there a problem? The guard asked, his tone firm and authoritative. Julian could not speak. He could not even breathe. He stumbled backward away from the counter, his eyes glued to the zeros on his phone screen. He turned and practically ran out of the bank, bursting back out into the warm afternoon air. He collapsed against the side of his car, gasping for oxygen like a drowning man. His entire world was collapsing around him in real time. In a fit of absolute blinding rage, Julian aggressively dialed my phone number. He pressed the phone so hard against his ear, it left a red mark. I was sitting comfortably in the leather seat of my private car, watching the Chicago skyline roll by when my phone began to buzz. I looked at the caller identification, saw Julian's name, and smiled. I swiped the screen to answer and brought the phone to my ear, remaining perfectly silent. Victoria, what did you do? Julian screamed into the receiver, his voice echoing with absolute madness. Where is my money? I just watched every single account drop to 0. You stole my money. You have completely ruined my life. I will kill you. I swear to God I will find you and I will kill you. I let him scream until his vocal cords were completely raw. When he finally paused to take a ragged breath, I spoke, my voice as calm and soothing as a winter breeze. You really need to lower your voice, Julian, I said smoothly. You are causing a scene on a public street, and you are currently the primary target of a federal tax investigation. It is not wise to draw attention to yourself. As for your money, I did not steal anything. I simply moved what was legally mine into a highly secure and completely untouchable blind trust. A trust that you have absolutely no legal claim to. How Julian demanded, his voice breaking into a pathetic and desperate sob. How could you possibly do that without my signature? I locked those accounts. I checked them every single day. You checked the front-end user interface. Julian, I replied, leaning back against my seat. You really should have paid more attention to the administrative privileges. Do you remember last year when you started taking those frequent and spontaneous business trips to Miami? You told me you were desperately trying to secure that massive venture capital firm to back your new software expansion. You would leave on a Thursday afternoon and not come back until late Monday night, smelling like expensive sunscreen and cheap perfume. Julian went dead silent on the other end of the line. While you were busy renting luxury cabanas and buying Madison endless rounds of mojitos on South Beach, I was sitting at our dining room table working. I continued, my tone dropping to a cold and calculated whisper. You handed me the entire financial restructuring portfolio to handle because you said you were just too stressed and overworked to deal with the accountants. You gave me your administrative security tokens. You gave me full authorization to file the new corporate charters. So I used all of that lovely free time you gave me to meticulously restructure our entire wealth portfolio. I created a labyrinth of holding companies. I legally transferred the liquid assets into a blind trust located in a jurisdiction that does not recognize American marital asset division. And I set the final execution protocol to trigger the exact second the judge slammed his gavel and declared our marriage legally over. You financed your own destruction with every single fake business trip you took. You are a monster, Julian whispered, the sheer gravity of his defeat crushing whatever tiny fraction of his ego was left. You are a cold and calculating psychopath, Victoria. You planned this for an entire year. You smiled at me every single day, knowing you were going to destroy me. I learned from the absolute best. Julian, I said, my voice devoid of any sympathy or regret. You smiled at me every single day, while you were funneling our money to a 24-year-old intern. The only difference is that you let your arrogance make you sloppy. I never make mistakes. Goodbye, Julian. I calmly pressed the red button on my screen, ending the call and completely cutting off his desperate screams. Julian stood, frozen against his car, his phone hanging limply in his hand. He was completely trapped. He had no money, no assets, no company, and no home. The federal government was hunting him, and he had no way to hire a defense attorney. But the universe was not quite done punishing him yet. Less than 5 seconds after I hung up the phone, Julian's screen lit up again. The caller identification flashed Madison's name. He stared at it for a moment, his mind desperately hoping she was calling to comfort him, to tell him they would figure this out together. He pressed answer and put the phone to his ear. Madison, he said, his voice trembling violently. Madison, everything is gone. Victoria took all of it. Julian, what the hell is wrong with your credit cards? Madison shrieked, her voice piercing through the speaker like a jagged piece of glass. She was not calling to comfort him. She was furious. I am standing at the checkout counter inside the Chanel boutique on the Magnificent Mile. I just tried to buy the limited edition lambskin and bag we talked about, and your stupid black card declined. The cashier tried it 3 times, Julian. Do you have any idea how completely humiliating this is? People are staring at me. They think I'm some kind of broke loser. Madison, you need to listen to me. Julian pleaded frantically, looking up and down the street for any sign of police cruisers. The accounts are frozen. The money is gone. We need to meet right now. I need you to use your personal savings to buy us 2 plane tickets out of Chicago. We have to leave immediately. There was a long and heavy pause on the other end of the line. The background noise of the luxury boutique seemed to completely fade away. Plane tickets. Madison asked, her voice dropping its high-pitched whine and replacing it with a cold and calculating sharpness. What do you mean the money is gone, Julian? You just won the $10 million company. You told me we were rich. You promised me we were going to be invincible. It was a trap. Julian cried, tears of sheer panic finally spilling over his eyelashes. Victoria set me up. The company is completely hollow. She transferred the liquid cash into a blind trust. The IRS is coming after me for $4 million in offshore tax evasion. They could arrest me at any second. I have absolutely nothing, Madison. You are the only person I have left. Please, you have to help me. The silence that followed was the most terrifying sound Julian had ever heard in his entire life. When Madison finally spoke, her voice was completely devoid of any love, affection, or loyalty. It was the voice of a pure opportunist, realizing her golden goose had just completely died. I am not going to prison for you, Julian, she said, her words biting like frost. I am 24 years old. I am not ruining my entire life because you were too stupid to realize your boring accountant wife was actively destroying you. Madison, please, you cannot do this, Julian begged, sliding down the side of his car until he was kneeling on the dirty concrete sidewalk. I love you. We are having a baby together. You have to help me. I am not paying for your mistakes. Madison snapped viciously. And you better fix this right now, Julian. You better find a way to get my money. Because if my bank account does not have a massive wire transfer in it by the end of the day, I am walking straight into the federal prosecutor's office. I know exactly where you kept the physical ledger for your illegal vendor kickbacks. I know the names of the board members you bribed. I will hand them every single piece of evidence they need to lock you away for 20 years in exchange for total immunity. Fix it, Julian. Fix it right now, or I swear to God I will bury you myself. The line went dead with a sharp click. Julian remained on his knees on the sidewalk, the phone pressed against his face, his mind completely shattering into a million irreparable pieces. The woman he had sacrificed his entire marriage for had just seamlessly transitioned into his most dangerous enemy. He was completely out of options, out of money, and out of time. The absolute zero balance in his bank account was nothing compared to the absolute zero left of his life. I did not have to be physically present in the room to know exactly how the next brutal chapter of Julian's nightmare would unfold. I had already used my administrative access to hack directly into the secure internal security camera system of the Vertex Solutions corporate headquarters. I sat comfortably in the back of my private car, watching the high-definition live feed on my encrypted tablet as Julian frantically arrived at his office. He was a man completely running out of oxygen. He had managed to bypass the lobby security guards only because the building manager had not yet officially received the expedited eviction notice from my newly established holding company. Julian sprinted into his massive executive suite, slamming the heavy glass door shut behind him and locking the deadbolt with trembling fingers. He immediately began tearing wildly through his mahogany desk drawers, looking for anything of significant value that he could pawn or use to bargain his way out of the country before the federal asset freeze locked him down completely. Less than 20 minutes later, the heavy glass door of the office rattled violently in its metal frame. Someone was aggressively pulling on the locked handle, trying to force their way inside. Julian froze completely, his eyes wide with raw terror staring at the frosted glass. He honestly thought it was the federal agents coming to serve his arrest warrant. He thought his time was absolutely up. But then a loud and piercing voice echoed sharply through the quiet corporate hallway. "Open this door right now, Julian, or I swear to God, I will smash it into a million pieces." It was Madison. She had driven straight from the luxury boutique on the Magnificent Mile to the corporate headquarters, burning with a highly toxic mixture of profound public humiliation and absolute unhinged rage. Julian let out a pathetic, heavy sigh of relief and quickly unlocked the deadbolt. That was the absolute worst mistake he could have possibly made. Madison pushed the heavy door open so incredibly hard that the metal handle slammed violently against the wall, completely cracking the expensive decorative drywall. She stormed into the executive suite, looking like a vengeful and highly destructive hurricane. Her designer shopping bags were entirely gone, replaced by tightly clenched fists, and a face flushed bright red with pure unfiltered fury. "Are you completely out of your mind, Madison?" Julian hissed desperately, trying to quiet her down and close the door. "Keep your voice down right now. I told you the accounts are totally frozen. The federal investigators are watching everything we do. We need to be invisible right now." "Invisible!" Madison screamed, stepping right up into his face and aggressively shoving his chest. "You want me to be invisible after you just humiliated me in front of half of the Gold Coast? I had to leave my entire cart at the register, Julian. The cashier looked at me like I was some kind of homeless person trying to steal scraps. You told me you were a millionaire. You promised me we were going out to celebrate our new amazing life together. And now you are standing here telling me your pathetic, boring accountant of a wife took every single dime you own." Julian immediately fell back on his favorite and most heavily utilized tactic. He desperately tried to gaslight her. He reached out and forcefully grabbed her shoulders, trying to force a comforting and dominant smile onto his deeply sweating face. "Madison, baby, you are completely overreacting," he said, his voice dropping into that incredibly smooth and manipulative tone he had successfully used on me for years. "You are letting your wild emotions completely cloud your rational judgment. Victoria did not actually take the money. It is just a temporary clerical freeze by the bank. They are just doing a standard random audit because of the massive divorce settlement transfer. Everything is perfectly fine and completely under control. I am the actual victim here. You need to support me right now instead of acting like a spoiled and selfish child. I am currently working on a massive financial solution, and I need you to just calm down and trust me implicitly. Telling a furious and highly greedy woman to calm down after completely ruining her financial future is exactly like throwing a lit match directly into a massive barrel of highly flammable gasoline. Madison did not calm down in the slightest. She violently shoved his hands off her shoulders, her eyes blazing with hatred. "Do not you ever speak to me like I am one of your stupid, naive interns, Julian," she shrieked, her voice vibrating with pure venom. "I am not your little disposable toy anymore. You lied to my face. You are absolutely broke, and you are standing here trying to make it sound like a simple bank error. I talked to my personal lawyer on the ride over here. He pulled the public financial filings. He told me the Internal Revenue Service is preparing a massive criminal indictment against you for offshore tax fraud. You have absolutely nothing left. You are a complete and total fraud." Madison then turned her blinding rage directly toward the physical room. She grabbed the expensive, heavy crystal decanter sitting on the edge of his polished mahogany desk and hurled it directly at the wall with all her strength. It shattered into 1,000 glittering pieces, sending expensive amber liquid splashing violently across his framed college diplomas and luxury wallpaper. Julian let out a loud shout of genuine panic and lunged forward to stop her, but Madison was completely out of control. She swept her arm violently across his massive desk, sending his dual high-definition computer monitors crashing heavily to the hardwood floor. The heavy glass screens cracked loudly against the wood, sending bright sparks flying from the violently severed power cords. She then grabbed his expensive heavy metal desk lamp and swung it like a baseball bat, smashing it directly into the massive floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city skyline. The thick reinforced glass spiderwebbed instantly, creating a terrifying and massive mosaic of fractured blinding light. "Stop it right now," Julian screamed aggressively, grabbing her by the waist and physically throwing her away from the broken windows. "Are you completely insane? You are destroying my office. It is not your office anymore," Madison screamed back, scrambling quickly to her feet, her chest heaving heavily with physical exertion. "You do not own anything anymore. You are a complete loser." She looked wildly around the ruined room, her eyes suddenly locking onto the heavy oak credenza positioned directly behind his desk. She knew exactly what was deeply hidden inside the bottom drawer of that cabinet. It was the small high-security biometric lockbox, where Julian securely kept his emergency physical cash reserves and his most sensitive personal documents. The very documents she had just threatened to aggressively hand over to the federal prosecutors on the phone. Madison lunged wildly for the credenza. Julian realized exactly what she was doing and let out a loud roar of absolute panic. He dove aggressively across the floor, tackling her right as her long manicured fingers fiercely grazed the metal handle of the bottom drawer. They crashed heavily to the floor in a pathetic and highly violent physical struggle. Julian was entirely focused on keeping the drawer firmly shut, but Madison fought back like a cornered, feral animal. She viciously clawed at his face, leaving deep, bloody scratches dragging down his cheek. She kicked her sharp stiletto heel directly into his shin, making him cry out loudly in intense, sudden pain. In the chaotic and desperate physical struggle, Julian's sweaty hand completely slipped from the drawer handle. Madison yanked the heavy oak drawer open with absolutely all of her remaining physical strength. The drawer flew open so violently that the small heavy metal lockbox resting inside shifted aggressively forward. Julian had been so frantic and careless in his previous panic attacks that he had completely forgotten to actually lock the secondary physical latch on the heavy box. As the drawer slammed violently against its wooden hinges, the heavy lid of the metal box popped entirely open. A thick stack of $100 bills spilled out onto the floor, but that was not what instantly caught Madison's sharp eye. Tumbling out from beneath the massive pile of cash and bouncing harshly against the hardwood floor was an incredibly cheap black prepaid burner phone. It slid rapidly across the smooth floor and stopped directly against Madison's knee. Julian froze instantly, his face completely draining of all remaining color. He stopped fighting her, completely staring at the small plastic device as if it were a highly venomous snake preparing to strike him dead. "Do not touch that," he whispered, his voice violently trembling, with a completely new and distinct type of raw terror. Madison looked carefully from his horrified, sweating face down to the cheap phone. Her sharp survival instincts took over instantly. She quickly snatched the phone off the floor and scrambled rapidly backward, pressing herself firmly against the cracked glass of the window. The digital screen was slightly cracked, but the phone itself was not locked with any kind of passcode. Julian had arrogantly assumed it was completely safe, forever hidden inside his private biometric box. Madison pushed the home button, and the screen lit up brightly, illuminating the dark corners of the ruined room. Her eyes darted rapidly across the bright digital display. The notification center was completely full. There were dozens of unread text messages and highly suspicious missed calls. She slowly opened the primary messaging application and began to intentionally read the text out loud, her voice dropping from a frantic, high-pitched scream to a terrifying and incredibly deadly whisper. "Good morning, handsome. Thank you so much for the amazing romantic weekend in Aspen. The diamond earrings are absolutely perfect. I cannot wait until you finally dump that annoying little intern and we can be together for real. Please call me tonight. Love, Sarah." The silence in the completely ruined executive suite was absolutely deafening. Only the faint electrical buzzing of the broken computer monitors broke the incredibly heavy tension in the air. Madison slowly lowered the cheap burner phone. She looked down at Julian, who was still kneeling helplessly on the covered floor, his hands raised slightly in a pathetic and useless gesture of surrender. He had not just been cheating on me, his devoted wife, with Madison. He had been actively cheating on his young, naive mistress with an entirely different woman. He had been secretly funding a third separate life using the exact same stolen corporate funds he had stolen from me. Madison Julian started weakly, his voice cracking pitifully in his dry throat. "Madison, you have to let me explain this to you. That is completely not what it looks like at all. She is just an aggressive client. It is a massive misunderstanding." Madison did not scream at him anymore. She did not attempt to throw another piece of expensive office equipment at his head. The highly greedy and deeply entitled anger that had aggressively fueled her violent rampage entirely vanished from her eyes. It was instantly and permanently replaced by something far more dangerous. It was replaced by the incredibly cold, calculating, and absolute vengeance of a woman who finally realized she was nothing more than a highly disposable joke to the man she had ruined her life for. She looked at Julian with dark eyes, completely devoid of any human sympathy or emotion. "You bought her diamonds," Madison stated softly, her voice echoing coldly in the destroyed empty room. "I risked my entire professional career for you. I aggressively lied to federal financial investigators for you. I actively helped you hide massive amounts of money from your wife. And you were busy spending it on some random girl named Sarah in Aspen. You actually called me an annoying little intern to her." "I did not say that," Julian begged, crawling slightly toward her on his bruised knees. "She said that about you. I love you, Madison. I was genuinely going to marry you." Madison let out a single sharp and entirely humorless laugh. She looked down at the burner phone in her shaking hand and then back up at the broken, bleeding, pathetic man on the floor. "You are not going to marry anyone, Julian. You are going away to a federal prison for a very long time. And I'm going to make absolutely certain that every single federal prosecutor working in this city gets a full downloaded and verified copy of every single text message, picture, and hidden bank routing number stored on this phone. I'm going to bury you so incredibly deep you will never see the sunlight again." Madison stood over Julian, with her chest heaving violently. She looked at the cheap black burner phone resting in her shaking hand, and then threw it incredibly hard against the wooden floorboard. The cheap plastic completely shattered, sending small black pieces flying across the room. Her dark eyes darted wildly around the completely ruined executive office, frantically searching for something else to violently unleash her absolute fury upon. She spotted a heavy, solid brass paperweight resting precariously on the very edge of the shattered mahogany desk. It was shaped exactly like a massive charging bull, a highly pathetic and deeply ironic symbol of Julian's former arrogant confidence. Madison lunged aggressively for it. She wrapped her manicured fingers tightly around the thick cold metal base and raised it high above her head. Julian screamed loudly, holding his bloody hands up desperately to protect his sweating face. He scrambled awkwardly backward across the polished hardwood floor, his expensive leather shoes slipping terribly on the spilled amber alcohol and completely shattered glass. "Madison, please," he begged, his voice cracking violently into a high-pitched, pathetic squeal. "Put that heavy thing down right now. You are going to literally kill me." Madison did not blink a single time. Her beautiful face was completely twisted into an incredibly dark mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. "I am going to completely cave your stupid lying head in," she shrieked, taking another massive threatening step toward him. "You completely ruined my entire life, Julian. You took absolutely everything from me and gave it to some random girl." I sat quietly in the luxurious leather seat of my private car, watching the high-definition screen of my encrypted tablet with absolute cold fascination. I honestly almost wanted to just sit back and watch her drop that heavy brass bull right onto his arrogant forehead. It would have been a highly poetic and entirely fitting end to his miserable existence. But my meticulously crafted timeline was far more precise than Madison's sudden blind physical rage. Just as she aggressively shifted her weight to violently swing the heavy metal object forward, a massive booming sound violently echoed through the entire corporate suite. The heavy frosted glass door of the executive office did not just swing open. It was violently and aggressively forced entirely off its metal hinges. A heavy solid steel battering ram suddenly smashed completely through the center of the frosted glass, sending thousands of tiny sharp fragments exploding violently across the dark room. Before the broken glass even finished hitting the floor, 4 heavily armed federal agents stormed aggressively into the completely ruined office. They were wearing dark, heavy tactical gear, with the bright yellow letters of the Federal Bureau clearly printed across their thick ballistic vests. Federal agents, one of the men aggressively shouted his deep voice, booming like a massive cannon in the confined office space. "Drop the weapon and put your hands completely in the air right now. Do not move a single muscle." Madison froze entirely in place. The heavy brass paperweight completely slipped from her trembling fingers and hit the wooden floor with an incredibly loud, dull thud. She stared blankly at the heavily armed men in absolute total shock, her mouth hanging wide open in complete disbelief. Julian remained pathetically cowering on the wet floor, his panicked eyes darting frantically between the dark tactical rifles pointed directly at their heads and the completely destroyed doorway. The lead agent, a tall, incredibly broad-shouldered man with a completely stern and entirely unforgiving face, stepped carefully over the violently broken doorframe. He reached into his tactical vest and held up a thick folded stack of official legal documents. "Julian Reynolds," he announced, his voice cutting sharply through the incredibly thick, heavy tension in the room. "We have an official federal warrant for your immediate physical arrest on multiple counts of severe offshore tax evasion, massive corporate fraud, and intentional wire fraud. We also possess a direct federal mandate to completely and immediately seize all physical assets, digital servers, and financial records located entirely on these premises. Stand up very slowly and place your hands directly behind your back." The absolute terrifying reality of the situation finally crashed down heavily on Julian's shaking shoulders. The absolute worst possible nightmare he could have ever imagined was violently unfolding right in front of his eyes. He looked desperately at the cold federal agents. He looked at the completely shattered windows. He looked at his entirely ruined desk. And then he looked directly at Madison. In that exact fraction of a single second, Julian made the most utterly cowardly and completely pathetic decision of his entire miserable life. He suddenly realized he was completely cornered, and his highly pathetic animal survival instinct completely took over his brain. "Wait!" Julian shouted desperately, pushing himself up onto his bruised knees and holding his shaking hands out, pleadingly toward the heavily armed agents. "You do not understand the situation. You absolutely have the wrong person entirely. I did not do any of this illegal garbage. It was completely her." He aggressively and violently pointed his shaking index finger directly at Madison's chest. Madison snapped her head toward him, her dark eyes widening in absolute horrific disbelief. "What are you talking about?" she gasped loudly, her voice barely a breathless whisper. "She is the primary account holder." Julian lied aggressively, his voice growing incredibly louder and far more frantic with every single pathetic word he spoke. "She is my former personal assistant. She had total unmonitored access to all the corporate routing numbers. Those hidden offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands are entirely registered directly in her name. She secretly forged my signature on all the massive wire transfers. She heavily manipulated the vendor kickbacks to personally fund her own incredibly luxury lifestyle. I just found out about it today. I swear to God, I am the actual completely innocent victim here. You need to arrest her immediately. She completely stole the money. I sat in the back of my car and let out a very soft, genuinely highly amused laugh. Julian was so incredibly and entirely predictable. He was completely willing to aggressively throw the woman he supposedly deeply loved directly in front of a rapidly speeding train just to buy himself a few completely miserable seconds of temporary freedom. He absolutely did not care about her. He completely did not care about the unborn baby she falsely claimed to be carrying. He only cared about desperately saving his own pathetic skin. But his highly desperate, cowardly lie was not completely baseless. During the complete height of their incredibly reckless affair, Julian had actually used Madison's personal social security number to secretly open several minor dummy bank accounts to temporarily hold his violently stolen cash. It was a massive and completely fatal mistake that I had highly easily discovered and heavily documented perfectly during my intense forensic audits. The tall lead agent did not even blink a single time. He slowly looked over at Madison, who was now physically shaking violently with pure, entirely unadulterated rage. Madison Reynolds, the federal agent, asked, his tone completely flat cold and entirely professional. "Yes," she whispered, her entire body trembling violently with absolute shock. "But he is completely lying to your face. I absolutely did not do any of this. He is the chief executive officer. He physically made me sign those blank papers. He told me it was just standard, regular corporate protocol." The agent gestured sharply to his left. Two large, heavily armored tactical officers instantly moved aggressively forward. They quickly grabbed Madison's arms aggressively and violently, twisting them behind her back. Madison let out an incredibly loud, piercing scream as the heavy, cold metal handcuffs clicked tightly around her slender wrists. "You have the right to remain completely silent." The lead agent began calmly and clearly reciting her federal rights completely over the loud sound of her frantic, angry screaming. "You absolute, pathetic, worthless coward!" Madison shrieked, entirely ignoring the federal agents holding her. She thrashed wildly and violently against the strong officers, trying desperately to break entirely free, and physically lunged directly at Julian. "I will completely kill you, Julian. I will absolutely completely destroy your entire life. I know exactly where you secretly hid the physical accounting ledgers. I know every single corporate board member you explicitly and illegally bribed. I will happily give them absolutely everything. Do you hear me, you absolute fraud? I will testify aggressively against you in federal open court. I will happily make sure you physically die in a tiny concrete cell, you absolute piece of complete garbage." The strong officers forcefully and aggressively dragged Madison toward the completely shattered doorway, her incredibly expensive designer heels dragging loudly and entirely uselessly across the ruined wooden floorboards. She aggressively continued to scream and curse violently, her loud voice echoing heavily down the quiet, empty corporate hallway. The lead federal agent slowly turned his attention back to the massive pile of entirely broken computer equipment on the floor, completely scanning the ruined room for the primary server connections. In that extremely brief, chaotic moment of absolute screaming, loud distraction, Julian completely saw his one and only pathetic chance for survival. He was still kneeling very near the massive floor-to-ceiling windows that Madison had completely shattered just moments earlier. The heavy metal desk lamp she had violently used as a weapon was still resting entirely on the windowsill, holding the incredibly thick spider-webbed glass very loosely in its heavy metal frame. Julian completely did not hesitate for a single second. He violently pushed himself completely off the wet floor and aggressively shoved his shoulder directly into the completely weakened center of the heavily cracked window. The entire massive pane of heavy reinforced glass completely gave way instantly. It violently exploded outward into the warm Chicago afternoon air and rained heavily down onto the completely empty alleyway 3 stories below. The incredibly sudden loud crashing sound of violently breaking glass instantly drew the complete attention of the federal agents. "Stop right there," the lead agent shouted loudly instantly, drawing his heavy sidearm and sprinting incredibly fast toward the broken window. "Julian, do not move a single inch." But Julian was already moving incredibly fast. He scrambled frantically and aggressively through the entirely jagged opening, completely ignoring the highly sharp shards of broken glass, tearing violently into his incredibly expensive custom suit jacket, and slicing extremely deep across his sweaty palms. He tumbled awkwardly out onto the heavily rusted metal grating of the exterior fire escape. He entirely lost his footing almost instantly and fell incredibly hard against the solid metal stairs, completely violently scraping the skin completely off his knees. But sheer absolute primal terror kept him moving aggressively forward. I watched him completely clearly through the external security cameras, perfectly located in the dark alleyway. The tablet feed switched completely seamlessly, perfectly tracking his entirely desperate, highly chaotic descent. He scrambled wildly and violently down the highly rusted metal steps, his face entirely covered in heavy sweat, dark blood, and pure, completely primal panic. He looked exactly like a completely cornered, completely feral rat, violently fleeing from a rapidly burning massive building. He aggressively reached the bottom metal landing and practically violently threw himself entirely over the metal railing, entirely dropping the final last 10 feet directly into the entirely dirty, trash-filled dark alley below. He aggressively hit the wet, solid asphalt incredibly hard, rolling aggressively to violently absorb the heavy impact before scrambling frantically and aggressively to his bleeding feet. He completely did not look back a single time. He violently sprinted, completely blindly down the dark, narrow alleyway, violently disappearing rapidly into the heavy shadows of the busy, crowded city streets. The federal agents stood aggressively at the broken window far above, looking down heavily into the entirely empty dark alley. They quickly and urgently spoke into their shoulder radios, aggressively calling for immediate perimeter heavy backup, and officially and completely declaring the suspect an active fleeing fugitive running entirely on foot. I calmly leaned back entirely against the highly plush leather seats of my car and completely, calmly locked the bright screen of my tablet. Julian was now a hunted animal with absolutely nowhere left to hide. The concrete walls of the underground parking structure were cold and damp. The flickering fluorescent lights cast terrifying shadows across the empty floor. I stood perfectly still next to the heavy concrete pillar, waiting patiently in the absolute silence of the lowest level. The air was incredibly thick and smelled heavily of motor oil and old rain. It had been exactly 48 hours since the federal raid violently dismantled Julian's entire pathetic life. Madison had managed to secure her release on a massive bail bond early this morning. And almost immediately after taking her very first breath of fresh air, she called my secure line. She wanted to make a deal. She thought she still held a winning hand in a game she had already entirely lost. She was completely delusional. The heavy echo of footsteps broke the dead silence. Madison emerged from the dark shadows of the concrete ramp. She looked absolutely nothing like the arrogant, glamorous woman who had poured expensive champagne on my tailored suit just days ago. Her perfectly styled blonde hair was messy and tied back into a loose knot. She was wearing cheap grey sweatpants and an oversized black hoodie, attempting desperately to hide her face from the world. But her eyes still held that same toxic, greedy desperation. She stopped 10 feet away from me, clutching a thick, heavy black leather-bound book tightly against her chest. That was the physical ledger, the holy grail of Julian's destruction. It contained every single handwritten note, every secret offshore routing number, and every illegal vendor kickback he had ever authorized. "You came," Madison said, her voice echoing sharply off the damp walls. Her tone was shaky, but she was trying incredibly hard to sound confident and in control. "I honestly did not think you would actually show up, Victoria." "I am here," I replied, my voice completely flat and devoid of any emotion. "You said you had something that belongs to me." Madison took a cautious step forward, holding the heavy black book slightly tighter against her chest. "It does not belong to you, Victoria. It belongs to the federal government. My defense attorney told me this specific ledger is the absolute missing link the prosecutors desperately need to guarantee Julian goes away for 20 years. Without it, he could potentially negotiate a lighter plea deal and blame half the fraud on my access. I am not taking the fall for his massive illegal mistakes." Madison continued, her voice rising slightly with panicked greed. "But I am also not handing this over for free. I want $500,000 in untraceable cash transferred to my offshore account by midnight. You give me the money, and I give you the power to ruin him completely." I looked at her standing there shivering slightly in the cold, damp air, demanding $500,000 from the exact woman she had actively helped destroy. I took a very slow and deliberate step toward her. My heels clicked loudly against the concrete, echoing like a ticking clock in the massive empty space. "You really have an incredible amount of sheer audacity, Madison," I said, keeping my voice low and steady. "I remember the annual corporate charity gala last December," I said, maintaining my steady, terrifying pace. "Do you remember that night, Madison? I wore a dark blue velvet gown, and I stood by the grand staircase greeting all the wealthy investors. You walked right up to me holding a glass of white wine. You looked me right in the eyes, and you gave me the sweetest, most innocent smile in the entire world. You complimented my dress. You told me how incredibly lucky Julian was to have such a supportive and brilliant wife. You stood there, looking like an absolute angel, pretending to be my friend, pretending to respect my marriage and my position in the company." Madison swallowed hard, taking a small step backward as I slowly closed the distance between us. And later, that exact same night, I continued my voice, dropping into a dangerous whisper. I went upstairs to the private executive lounge to find my husband, but the heavy oak door was locked. I stood in the quiet carpeted hallway and I listened. I heard your high-pitched giggles, Madison. I heard the clinking of glasses. I stood outside that door for 20 entire minutes, knowing exactly what was happening inside. You smiled right at my face, and then you went upstairs and slept with my husband on a leather couch bought with my personal money. You drank my wine. You spent my money. You slept with my husband. And now you have the absolute nerve to stand in this dark garage and demand $500,000 from me. You are completely worthless." Madison stood her ground, her jaw clenching tightly in pure, stubborn defiance. "That is just how the world works, Victoria." She snapped, her voice trembling with leftover arrogant pride. "I did what I had to do to secure my own future. Julian promised me the world. He lied to both of us, but right now, I am the only one holding the physical key to his prison cell. You want him destroyed just as much as I do. You have millions of dollars safely hidden away in your blind trust. 500,000 is absolute pocket change to you. Pay me the money, or I will take this ledger and I will burn it into ashes right now. I will let him negotiate a plea deal and you will never get the justice you crave." I was now standing less than 2 feet away from her. I could clearly see the dark, exhausted circles under her eyes and the frantic pulse beating rapidly in her neck. I slowly reached out and placed my hand firmly over hers, resting right on top of the heavy black leather ledger. "I am not going to pay you a single dime, Madison." I said, my words slicing through the cold air like a perfectly sharpened blade. Madison tried to yank the book away from me, but my grip was like solid iron. "Let go of me," she panicked, her voice spiking into a terrified squeal. "I will burn it, Victoria. I swear to God I will destroy it." I smiled at her, a cold, terrifying smile that made her entire body completely freeze. "You cannot burn it, Madison," I whispered softly right into her face, "because you are absolutely out of time and you are completely out of leverage." I slowly unbuttoned the top button of my tailored silk blouse. I pulled the fabric slightly aside to reveal a small black, highly advanced microphone securely taped directly to my collarbone. It was a Federal wire transmitter. Madison's eyes widened in absolute sheer horror as she stared at the small blinking red light. "You are wearing a wire?" she gasped, her breathing instantly becoming rapid and shallow. "You brought the Federal agents here. You completely set me up." She reached frantically into the pocket of her oversized hoodie and pulled out her smartphone, desperately trying to dial her high-priced defense attorney. Her thumbs flew rapidly across the bright screen. Absolutely nothing happened. She stared at the phone in complete disbelief, her terror rising fast as the screen remained frozen. "There is absolutely no cell service down here, Madison," I explained smoothly, letting go of her hand and taking a very casual step back. "My brother-in-law Marcus parked his highly customized security vehicle right above us on the street level. He is actively running a military-grade signal jammer that completely blocks all cellular and wireless frequencies within a 2-block radius. Your phone is a completely useless piece of plastic right now. And this microphone I am wearing is actively recording every single word directly to a heavily encrypted hard drive inside his truck. You just loudly and clearly confessed to actively withholding highly critical federal evidence in a massive ongoing criminal investigation. You just explicitly attempted to aggressively extort $500,000 from a key witness in a federal case. You just completely destroyed your entire life. The heavy black ledger suddenly slipped from her shaking fingers and hit the floor. She dropped to her knees, sobbing uncontrollably. "Please, Victoria," she begged. "Please do not do this to me. I have nothing. My accounts are entirely frozen. I will give you the book. Just please, do not share that recording. I will do absolutely anything you want." I slowly bent down and picked up the heavy ledger. "You're going to walk out of here, Madison," I said calmly. "You will sign a full immunity proffer, turning state witness against Julian. You will testify to his massive fraud for absolutely nothing but legal immunity." I turned my back and walked entirely away, leaving her completely broken in the dark, damp shadows of the empty underground concrete parking garage, forever. Julian was completely out of options, out of money, and rapidly running out of time. But a desperate man with a silver tongue will always try to find one last dark corner to hide in. He had spent the entire night hiding in a cheap roadside motel, paying with the few crumpled $20 bills he had left in his pocket. By the time the sun rose over the Chicago skyline, he had frantically arranged an emergency meeting with his silent investors. These were the wealthy, greedy men who had initially funded his extravagant lifestyle under the table, expecting massive unregulated returns from Vertex Solutions. Julian knew that if he could just get them into a room and use his practiced charm, he could convince them to write a massive emergency bailout check. He rented a highly secure private boardroom in a luxury hotel downtown using a completely fake name. There were 3 investors sitting around the massive polished mahogany table. They were older men in expensive tailored suits wearing gold watches that cost more than most people made in a decade. Julian stood at the head of the table, heavily sweating through his incredibly cheap borrowed dress shirt. He was pacing back and forth, waving his hands frantically as he spun the most elaborate and desperate lie of his entire life. He completely omitted the terrifying fact that the federal government had violently raided his corporate office the day before. Instead, he confidently told them that the Internal Revenue Service was simply conducting a highly routine and entirely temporary audit on a minor clerical error. He insisted that his vindictive ex-wife had temporarily frozen his primary checking accounts out of pure spite. "All I need is a temporary bridge loan of $2 million, Julian pleaded, his voice dripping with entirely fake sincerity. Just enough to unfreeze the primary corporate accounts and settle the minor tax discrepancy. I will personally guarantee a 40% return on this bridge loan within exactly 3 months. You all know my absolute genius. You know the massive value of the proprietary source code I built. We are completely on the verge of $1 billion buyout, and I absolutely cannot let a jealous, angry woman ruin our massive payday." The 3 wealthy men exchanged highly skeptical glances. They were greedy, but they were not entirely stupid. They could clearly see the dark, heavy bags under Julian's eyes and the terrified, frantic pulse beating rapidly in his neck. But Julian had always been an incredibly skilled salesman. He had spent 10 entire years perfectly honing his ability to sell completely hollow promises. He leaned heavily against the mahogany table, lowering his voice into a smooth, confident register, playing directly to their massive egos and deep financial greed. "Think about the incredible return on investment, gentlemen," Julian urged softly. $2 million today guarantees you absolute generational wealth tomorrow. Do not let this incredibly minor temporary setback scare you away from the biggest financial victory of your entire lives. The oldest investor, a man with silver hair and a sharp calculating gaze, finally let out a long, heavy sigh. He slowly reached into the inside pocket of his expensive tailored suit jacket and pulled out a sleek leather checkbook. He unscrewed the cap of his expensive gold fountain pen. "Fine, Julian," the old man grumbled, his voice rough and entirely devoid of warmth. "We will write the bridge loan right now. But if you are lying to us about the severity of this federal audit, we will personally ruin you long before the government even gets a chance." Julian let out a massive, ragged breath of pure relief. A bright, arrogant smile completely washed over his bruised and exhausted face. He honestly thought He had just successfully manipulated his way completely out of the trap. He thought he had completely won. Right as the heavy gold nib of the fountain pen touched the crisp paper of the check, the massive double doors of the private boardroom swung entirely open. The heavy solid oak doors hit the adjacent walls with an incredibly loud booming crash that violently shook the expensive crystal water glasses resting on the table. Julian aggressively snapped his head up, his arrogant smile instantly vanishing into thin air. I walked confidently into the massive room. I was wearing a flawless, custom-tailored, stark white power suit that radiated absolute authority and cold, untouchable wealth. My posture was completely perfect, my chin held incredibly high. Walking exactly one step behind me was Marcus, my brilliant African-American brother-in-law. He was wearing a sharp, dark charcoal suit, his broad shoulders and commanding physical presence instantly dominating the entire room. Marcus securely held a sleek silver encrypted laptop firmly under his right arm. "What the hell are you doing here?" Julian screamed, his voice instantly breaking into a pathetic, terrified, high-pitched squeal. He frantically pointed his shaking finger directly at my face. "Get out of this room right now, Victoria. This is a highly secure private business meeting. You have absolutely no legal right to be here. I will call hotel security and have you physically dragged out into the street." I completely ignored his pathetic, frantic screaming. I did not even look at him. I walked slowly and deliberately right up to the massive polished mahogany table. My expensive high heels clicked loudly and rhythmically against the hardwood floor, echoing like a heavy, fatal countdown in the entirely silent room. The three wealthy investors stared at me in absolute complete shock, their expensive gold pens hovering entirely frozen in the air. "Gentlemen," I said, my voice incredibly calm, smooth, and absolutely echoing with pure power. "I highly recommend that you put your checkbooks entirely away right now, unless, of course, you are actively looking to be federally indicted for intentionally funding a massive criminal fugitive." Julian lunged violently forward, his face turning bright red with pure, unadulterated panic. "Do not listen to a single word this crazy woman says," he shouted, desperately trying to block their view of me. "She is my incredibly bitter ex-wife. She is completely delusional, and she's intentionally trying to destroy my massive company because she's jealous of my success." I slowly turned my head and finally looked directly at Julian. My eyes were completely cold, empty, and entirely devoid of any human sympathy. "It is not your company anymore, Julian," I stated perfectly clearly, my voice easily cutting right through his loud, pathetic lies. "It has not been your company for weeks." I then turned my completely steady gaze directly toward the three silent investors. "My name is Victoria." I continued, my tone dropping into a highly lethal and absolute serious register. "And I am entirely aware of the highly illegal shadow investments you three gentlemen have been secretly funneling into Vertex Solutions over the past 2 years. I know exactly how you completely bypassed the standard federal oversight committees. I know exactly which dummy corporations you heavily utilized to hide your massive untaxed profits." The oldest investor instantly turned completely pale. He slowly lowered his gold pen to the table, his hands suddenly shaking slightly. "How could you possibly know about any of that?" the old man whispered, his voice entirely stripped of its former arrogant confidence. "Because I am the primary forensic accountant who built the entire financial infrastructure of the company," I replied smoothly, offering them a chilling, predatory smile. "And more importantly, gentlemen, I am now your absolute direct boss." Julian let out a loud, entirely humorless laugh, clapping his hands together in a pathetic display of fake amusement. "You are completely insane, Victoria. You are absolutely out of your mind. You do not own anything." Marcus casually stepped completely forward, entirely ignoring Julian's frantic outburst. He set the sleek silver laptop directly onto the polished mahogany table and smoothly opened the screen. He tapped the keyboard exactly twice, bringing up a series of highly official, perfectly authenticated legal documents. 3 weeks ago, Marcos explained, his deep, steady voice commanding absolute total respect in the room. My client legally established a highly secure, heavily funded blind trust. Yesterday afternoon, she utilized those completely untouchable funds to aggressively and entirely purchase all outstanding corporate debt associated with Vertex Solutions. That specifically includes the massive shadow loans you three gentlemen secretly provided. I leaned slightly forward, placing both of my hands firmly flat on the smooth table, entirely trapping the three investors in my cold, calculating gaze. I completely bought out your entire debt positions, gentlemen, I said softly. I legally own every single penny Julian owes you. I am the sole primary creditor of his entire miserable life. And because I now own that specific debt, I also completely own the highly detailed physical records of your illegal, unregulated investments. If you write him a check today, you are officially funding a man who currently has an active federal arrest warrant out for his immediate capture. You will become highly active criminal accomplices in a massive federal tax evasion conspiracy. The three wealthy investors stared at the digital documents on the screen in absolute pure horror. They were greedy men, but they completely valued their own freedom far more than they cared about Julian. The oldest investor violently snapped his leather checkbook completely shut. He shoved his expensive gold pen hurriedly into his pocket and aggressively stood up from his leather chair. We are completely, entirely done here. Julian, the old man growled, his voice vibrating with absolute pure fury. Do not ever contact me again. Do not ever come near my family or my businesses. No. Julian screamed, aggressively lunging toward the old man and desperately grabbing his expensive suit jacket. Please, you cannot leave me right now. She's completely bluffing. She does not actually have any physical proof of the fraud. I hid the primary physical ledger completely perfectly. She has absolutely nothing to give to the federal prosecutors. I smiled again. A slow, deeply satisfying smile that completely promised absolute total destruction. Marcus. If you would be so kind, I said quietly. Marcus tapped a single button on the laptop keyboard. Instantly, the incredibly clear, high-definition audio recording from the underground parking garage echoed loudly through the entire private boardroom. It was Madison's frantic, terrified voice completely filling the silent room. I will not take the fall for his massive illegal mistakes, Madison's recorded voice cried out entirely clearly. I want $500,000 in untraceable cash. You give me the money, and I give you the power to ruin him completely. I know exactly where he secretly hid the physical accounting ledgers. I know every single corporate board member he explicitly and illegally bribed. The audio recording completely stopped. The silence that immediately followed was absolutely entirely deafening. Julian slowly let go of the old investor's suit jacket. He stumbled entirely backward, his legs completely giving out underneath him. He hit the edge of the polished mahogany table and slid pathetically down to the floor, his entire reality completely shattering into a million irreparable pieces. He finally entirely realized that I had already secured the primary physical ledger. I completely possessed absolutely every single piece of evidence required to bury him permanently inside a tiny concrete cell for the rest of his natural life. The three investors did not say another single word. They aggressively grabbed their expensive leather briefcases and practically ran out of the massive double doors, entirely fleeing the room like completely terrified rats escaping a rapidly sinking ship. They left Julian completely entirely alone. He was sitting pathetically on the floor of the expensive rented boardroom, staring entirely blankly at the wall. He had absolutely no money. He had absolutely no allies. He had absolutely no remaining leverage. His mistress had entirely betrayed him, and his investors had completely abandoned him. I stood completely tall, looking down at the broken, pathetic shell of the man who had completely underestimated my absolute power. You really should have just stayed home and played the role of a loyal husband. Julian? I said, my voice echoing softly in the empty, luxurious room. But you entirely chose to declare absolute war against the exact woman who actively built your entire castle. And now you get to physically watch me burn it entirely to the ground. Let us go, Marcus. We are completely finished here. The heavy, solid oak doors closed completely shut behind us, sealing him entirely inside his temporary expensive tomb. The hotel corridor was entirely quiet and perfectly peaceful. I felt absolutely no guilt or remorse for what I had completely orchestrated. I had simply returned the exact same energy he had secretly given me for years, just multiplied by absolute sheer financial brilliance. I sat in the passenger seat of the heavy armored security vehicle, watching the tall glass skyscrapers of the downtown financial district slowly disappear behind us. The boardroom coup had been an absolute flawless execution of pure financial warfare. I had completely stripped Julian of his final remaining lifeline and watched him entirely collapse onto the expensive hardwood floor. I felt a profound sense of absolute closure washing heavily over my tired shoulders. I slowly turned my head and looked at Marcus, who was navigating the heavy afternoon city traffic with his usual quiet and intense focus. We had completely dismantled a highly dangerous monster. We had entirely removed every single weapon he possessed. Or at least, I honestly thought we had. I had severely and completely underestimated the highly lethal and entirely unpredictable desperation of a toxic man who suddenly discovers he has absolutely nothing left to lose. My highly secure cell phone suddenly vibrated violently against the dark leather of the center console. The loud buzzing sound made me jump slightly in my comfortable seat. I glanced down at the bright digital screen. The caller identification simply displayed a restricted private number. I felt a sudden cold knot form tightly in the bottom of my stomach. I reached out and tapped the bright green button, immediately putting the phone on the loud external speaker so Marcus could hear every single word. "Hello," I said, my voice completely steady and entirely unbothered. A heavy, ragged, and highly erratic breathing echoed loudly through the small enclosed cabin of the truck. It was absolutely not the sound of a completely defeated, broken man. It was the terrifying and entirely primal sound of a completely cornered, dangerous predator rapidly preparing to aggressively strike back. "Hello, Victoria." Julian whispered, his voice vibrating heavily with a dark, entirely unhinged and completely psychotic energy. "You really honestly thought you were so incredibly smart today in that hotel. You genuinely thought you could just publicly humiliate me in front of my wealthiest private investors and then simply walk away completely untouched. You thought you had entirely won the war, but you completely forgot one very important and highly critical detail about me, Victoria. I know absolutely everything about you. I know exactly where all of your deepest weak spots are completely hidden." A sudden, sharp, icy chill ran directly down my spine. The absolute supreme confidence I had felt just 10 short minutes ago instantly evaporated into thin air. "Where are you right now, Julian?" I demanded, my tone entirely shifting from cold professional amusement to a highly alert and deeply terrified tension. I heard the highly distinct, loud sliding sound of a heavy glass patio door opening and firmly closing. "I am currently standing inside a very beautiful and entirely quiet suburban kitchen," Julian replied, his voice dripping heavily with pure toxic malice. "It has lovely, expensive granite countertops and a very nice, peaceful view of a large, completely fenced backyard. It is incredibly quiet out here in the suburbs this afternoon. Your younger sister, Jessica, really has a beautiful and perfectly decorated home, Victoria. It is an absolute crying shame she completely forgot to manually set her heavy backdoor security alarm before she left for her office this morning." My heart completely stopped entirely dead in my chest. Marcus violently slammed his heavy leather boot directly onto the thick brake pedal, pulling the massive security truck aggressively and violently onto the paved shoulder of the busy highway. His dark, intense eyes widened in absolute sheer horrified disbelief. Julian was physically inside my sister's private home. "Oh, and I am not entirely alone here today." Julian continued, a sick, cruel, and highly disturbing laugh, echoing loudly through the small phone speaker. "I have a very friendly and highly cooperative little hostage here with me. Come here, buddy. Come over here and say hello to your favorite Aunt Victoria." I heard a soft, highly terrified, and deeply pathetic whimper. Then the loud, frantic scratching sound of heavy canine paws slipping wildly and desperately against the smooth hardwood floors. It was Cooper, my sister's innocent 4-year-old golden retriever. The sweet dog let out a sharp, incredibly painful and loud yelp as Julian aggressively and violently grabbed him directly by his thick leather collar. "Let the dog go right now, Julian. I shouted loudly, my voice completely losing its controlled professional edge and entirely breaking with pure raw panic. If you physically touch one single hair on that innocent animal, I swear to God, I will personally tear you completely apart. Julian laughed loudly again, a highly disturbing and entirely empty sound that made my blood run entirely freezing cold. Oh, please do not worry. I absolutely do not want the stupid, loud dog, Victoria. He sneered viciously. The dumb dog is just simple physical collateral damage to completely ensure you give me exactly what I heavily demand. But I did easily find something else highly interesting while I was entirely destroying your sister's master bedroom looking for a private safe. Something I know you care about far more than any living, breathing physical creature. I heard the sharp, bright, metallic clinking sound of a heavy jewelry chain. It was a specific, delicate sound I instantly and entirely recognized. It was the unmistakable sound of my late mother's vintage heavy platinum and highly valuable green emerald pendant necklace. That specific antique necklace was the absolute most precious and entirely irreplaceable thing in my entire world. It was the absolute only physical piece of my mother I had left after she passed away from a completely brutal and highly aggressive battle with cancer exactly 7 years ago. I had specifically and secretly given it to Jessica for extreme physical safekeeping during the highly messy and entirely toxic divorce proceedings, entirely terrified that Julian would try to secretly steal and pawn it to privately fund his massive hidden offshore debts. He had absolutely found it. He was physically holding the last remaining physical piece of my mother's beautiful soul directly in his greedy, heavily sweating hands. Do you hear that delicate sound? Victoria Julian taunted, aggressively dragging the heavy, expensive platinum chain roughly and violently against the hard granite kitchen counter. It is an absolutely beautiful and highly flawless piece of antique jewelry. I strongly bet it would easily fetch a very high cash price on the underground black market. Or maybe I should just quickly walk out to the garage and take a heavy solid steel hammer and completely smash this gorgeous green emerald into 1,000 tiny entirely worthless pieces right here on the kitchen floor. What do you honestly think, Victoria? Should I completely and violently destroy your mother's sacred memory exactly like you completely and violently destroyed my entire life? Do not touch it. I whispered, my hands shaking so violently I could barely physically hold the phone with a completely new, entirely terrifying type of pure maternal rage. I will give you absolutely anything you want, Julian. I will fix everything. Just please, put the antique necklace down on the counter and walk completely away from that house before my sister gets home from work. I absolutely do not want just anything, Julian spat, his voice instantly dropping all fake theatrical amusement and entirely transforming into pure venomous lethal hatred. I want absolutely everything back right now. I want the massive liquid assets you completely stole from me entirely returned. I want the secure blind trust immediately and legally dissolved, and the entire cash balance entirely transferred directly into an untraceable offshore digital cryptocurrency wallet. And I want you to completely and legally sign over the primary software patent rights to Vertex Solutions right now. You're going to immediately drive and entirely meet me at the abandoned industrial shipping docks on the deep south side of the city. You are going to come completely and entirely alone. If I see a single flashing police cruiser, if I see Marcus hiding in the shadows, if I see absolutely anyone else, I will completely shatter this green emerald into entirely worthless dust. And then I will violently and aggressively kill this stupid, whimpering dog, and I will sit right here in the dark and wait for your sister to walk through the front door. The sheer level of completely psychotic violence in his tone was absolutely paralyzing. He was no longer a greedy, arrogant corporate fraud. He was a completely desperate, highly lethal, cornered animal who was entirely willing to commit absolute murder to regain his lost power. He had completely crossed the absolute final line of human decency. He was heavily threatening the physical lives of my entirely innocent family members, simply because he was completely incapable of accepting his own monumental failures. You have exactly 1 single hour. Victoria, Julian declared, his voice echoing with absolute cold, entirely terrifying finality. 1 single hour to completely and entirely reverse every single thing you violently did to me. If you are even 1 single minute late, You will spend the rest of your entirely miserable, empty life heavily regretting the day you arrogantly decided to declare financial war on me. The phone line went completely dead with a sharp, loud click. The heavy silence inside the armored truck was entirely deafening. Marcus looked directly at me, his dark eyes entirely filled with cold, lethal determination. I looked down at the dark screen of my phone, my fear completely entirely vanishing and rapidly transforming into a highly focused, absolutely deadly, and entirely unstoppable rage. He wanted a final physical confrontation at the docks. I was completely ready to give him exactly what he aggressively asked for. I looked at the dark screen of my phone and completely refused to cower. I did not cry, and I absolutely did not scream. The sudden, violent threat against my sister and her innocent dog did not break me in the slightest. Instead, it entirely forged me into absolute solid iron. Julian honestly thought he could simply use my deepest emotional vulnerabilities to aggressively force me into total submission. He genuinely thought holding my late mother's emerald necklace hostage would instantly make me blindly follow his psychotic and desperate demands. But he had fundamentally misunderstood the core difference between us for the entire duration of our 10-year marriage. When Julian is completely cornered, he acts out of pure, frantic, terrified desperation. When I am completely cornered, I entirely destroy the corner itself. I slowly turned my head and looked directly at Marcus. The heavy silence inside the armored security vehicle was instantly and entirely shattered by the cold, lethal determination completely burning in his dark eyes. Marcus is not just a standard corporate cybersecurity auditor, he is a highly trained digital warfare expert, and absolutely nobody heavily threatens his family without facing massive catastrophic consequences. Marcus did not say a single word. He immediately spun around in the heavy leather driver's seat and forcefully reached into the thick reinforced steel lockbox securely positioned directly between the front seats. He pulled out a massive, ruggedized black military-grade laptop and violently slammed it open onto the center console. This was absolutely not the sleek silver computer he had casually used in the hotel boardroom earlier today. This was his primary mobile digital command center. The thick digital screen instantly lit up with dozens of rapidly scrolling bright green command prompts. We need to find exactly what vehicle he is currently driving. Marcus stated, his deep voice, entirely devoid of panic and completely filled with absolute surgical precision. He aggressively fled the corporate office completely on foot yesterday, but he had to travel all the way to the deep suburbs to violently break into Jessica's house. He either stole a random vehicle or he aggressively carjacked an innocent person. Either way, he is currently moving rapidly toward the southern industrial docks. I need his exact live digital footprint right now. I immediately reached into my bag and pulled out my secondary highly encrypted digital tablet. I quickly accessed the primary cloud storage account I had secretly synced to Julian's cheap prepaid burner phone long before Madison had completely smashed it on the hardwood floor. I did not just read those disgusting text messages to his other mistress. I secretly and quietly installed a highly advanced background tracking malware directly into the root directory of that specific digital device. When Madison violently destroyed the physical phone, the digital tracking ghost remained entirely active and completely attached to his primary cellular network identifier. I quickly typed the complex hexadecimal access codes and watched the bright digital screen illuminate. I have a live digital ping. I said, my voice completely steady and entirely cold. He completely threw away the broken plastic pieces, but his expensive primary smartwatch is still actively attempting to blindly sync with the destroyed device network. He is moving incredibly fast down the primary southbound interstate highway. Marcus forcefully grabbed the digital coordinates from my screen and completely integrated them directly into his highly advanced global tracking software. Got him! Marcus announced, his heavy fingers flying aggressively and rapidly across the thick black illuminated keyboard. He is currently driving a brand new, highly connected luxury electric sedan. He absolutely stole it from the wealthy suburban neighborhood right after he violently broke into Jessica's house. That is an incredibly massive and entirely fatal mistake for him to make. Modern luxury cars are basically just giant, highly vulnerable computers completely rolling on 4 rubber tires. Give me exactly 60 seconds, Victoria and I will completely entirely own the main central processing unit of that stolen vehicle. I will have absolute total digital control over his global positioning system, his automated steering sensors, and his internal digital audio interface. You need to get into your own personal car right now. You need to drive directly to the southern docks exactly like he aggressively demanded on the phone. You will be the perfect physical bait. I will be the invisible digital ghost actively hunting him entirely from the dark shadows. I quickly stepped out of the heavy armored truck and walked briskly toward my sleek black sedan parked very discreetly at the dark end of the quiet city street. I slid gracefully into the soft leather driver's seat and forcefully pushed the glowing ignition button. The quiet engine roared completely to life. I smoothly pulled out onto the busy city streets, steering the heavy vehicle directly toward the entirely abandoned industrial shipping docks. I connected my highly secure wireless earpiece directly to the audio feed from Marcus. My hands gripped the soft leather steering wheel completely tight. The warm afternoon sun was slowly beginning to set, entirely casting long, terrifying dark shadows across the tall concrete city buildings. I was entirely ready to finally finish this entirely toxic chapter of my life. Through the secure digital earpiece, I could clearly hear the rapid aggressive clicking of Marcus typing heavily on his rugged keyboard. I am entirely inside the primary security firewall of his stolen vehicle, Marcus announced smoothly, his deep voice echoing clearly in my right ear. I have completely and entirely locked him out of the main digital dashboard. He cannot manually control the internal air temperature. He cannot manually control the automatic glass windows. He cannot even manually turn off the internal digital radio. I am actively routing your personal microphone audio directly through his incredibly expensive 14-speaker surround sound system. Whenever you are entirely ready, Victoria, you can officially begin the psychological warfare protocol. I want you to completely, entirely break his fragile mind before you even physically reach the abandoned shipping docks. I took a very deep, completely steadying breath. I pressed the secure digital transmission button firmly located on my leather steering wheel. I knew exactly what Julian was currently doing inside that stolen car. He was speeding aggressively down the open highway, his sweating hands gripping the steering wheel in absolute pure frantic panic, his terrified eyes darting rapidly between the open road and the highly valuable stolen green emerald necklace sitting completely unsecured on the empty passenger seat. He honestly thought he was the ultimate powerful predator, entirely controlling the entire dangerous narrative. I leaned slightly forward and spoke directly into the hidden dashboard microphone. My voice was incredibly soft, entirely cold and completely dripping with terrifying authority. Hello again, Julian. I whispered, my voice suddenly blasting incredibly loudly and entirely clearly through the 14 premium audio speakers securely installed inside his stolen vehicle. I distinctly heard him let out a completely sudden loud gasp of pure, unadulterated, physical terror over the live audio feed. He aggressively and violently slammed his heavy foot entirely onto the thick brake pedal, causing the expensive rubber tires to screech violently against the hard highway asphalt, before he frantically and desperately corrected the heavy steering wheel. Did you honestly entirely believe you could simply steal a highly connected digital vehicle and completely disappear into the dark shadows? I asked, my voice swirling rapidly around his confined leather cabin like a dark, heavy, terrifying ghost. You really are entirely incredibly stupid, Julian. You completely think like a pathetic, helpless amateur. You are literally driving a massive, highly trackable digital beacon directly into my final trap. How are you doing this? Julian screamed wildly, entirely slapping his highly sweaty hands aggressively and violently against the bright digital dashboard, trying desperately to completely turn the massive screen off. Shut up. Shut up right now, Victoria. I swear to God I will completely smash this emerald necklace. The intelligent dashboard screen completely ignored his frantic physical strikes entirely. Instead, the bright digital display violently flickered rapidly, and then instantly turned entirely pitch black, before brightly illuminating with a massive solid red digital warning symbol. Marcus had completely and permanently overridden the primary visual display. You are absolutely not going to completely smash anything, Julian, I replied, my voice completely, entirely calm and entirely unrelenting. Because if you even attempt to physically touch that antique necklace right now, I will instruct my digital security expert to immediately and violently deploy all 8 internal safety airbags inside that vehicle while you are currently traveling at exactly 85 miles per hour. I will casually let the heavy explosive deployment force completely shatter your ribs and aggressively break your jaw. And then I will simply drive directly to the bloody crash site and casually take my mother's antique necklace right out of your completely unconscious bleeding hands. Do you completely understand me, Julian? I entirely, absolutely own the metallic box you are currently sitting inside. Julian let out a loud, entirely pathetic, and highly desperate whimpering sound. He frantically tried to manually roll down the heavy glass windows to completely escape my terrifying loud voice, but the electronic door buttons were completely, entirely dead. He tried to aggressively push the heavy metal door locks, but the heavy steel security pins remained violently and securely locked entirely in place. He was completely physically trapped entirely inside a high-speed moving electronic prison. You are absolutely not the hunter, Julian. I continued, my voice dropping into a highly lethal, entirely serious and completely cold tone. You have absolutely never been the powerful hunter. I entirely built the massive corporate empire you arrogantly claimed as your own. I completely, entirely controlled the massive wealth you stupidly thought you successfully stole from me. And right now, I completely, absolutely control the steering telemetry of the exact car you are frantically driving. To completely prove my absolute terrifying point, Marcus violently and aggressively manipulated the electronic stability control digital sensors entirely from his remote laptop. The leather steering wheel inside Julian's stolen luxury car violently jerked entirely to the left, completely on its own digital accord. The heavy vehicle swerved aggressively and violently across the white-painted highway lane lines, tires squealing incredibly loudly before Marcus instantly and aggressively corrected it violently, pulling the heavy car back directly into the center safety lane. Julian screamed loudly, a completely high-pitched, entirely primal scream of absolute pure panic. He violently threw both of his heavily shaking hands up entirely off the leather wheel, completely terrified that the intelligent car was actively trying to violently and entirely kill him. Keep your sweaty, disgusting hands firmly on the wheel, Julian. I commanded sharply, my voice cracking incredibly loudly like a heavy leather whip inside his dark enclosed cabin. You heavily demanded a private meeting at the Southern Industrial Docks. We are absolutely going directly to the docks. But you are going to drive exactly the legal speed limit. You're going to completely obey every single basic traffic law. You're going to completely stop entirely pretending that you possess even a single ounce of actual power in this dynamic. You completely threatened the physical life of my innocent sister and her completely harmless dog. You heavily threatened the absolutely sacred loving memory of my dead mother. You completely and violently crossed the absolute final boundary of human decency. And now you are going to physically entirely experience exactly what absolute total permanent destruction truly feels like. Julian was entirely and completely hyperventilating now. His panicked breath came in short, loud, ragged, desperate gasps that echoed completely clearly through my highly secure earpiece. He was completely and audibly sobbing. The massive arrogant ego that had aggressively and entirely fueled his entire toxic life had finally completely and entirely shattered into absolute dust. He was entirely reduced to a completely terrified, crying, helpless child, securely locked inside a heavy digital cage he could absolutely never escape. I will completely give you whatever you want. Julian cried loudly, his voice breaking pitifully over the loud audio connection. Please, Victoria, just completely let me out of this car. Please entirely stop completely torturing my mind. I will leave the green antique necklace right here on the passenger seat entirely untouched. I will entirely leave the city completely and absolutely never come back. Please, just let me go. I am entirely and completely done listening to your pathetic, entirely useless lies, Julian. I stated coldly, entirely ignoring his completely desperate and highly pathetic begging. You completely dug this massive dark grave entirely by yourself. And now you're going to absolutely lie down directly inside of it. The abandoned industrial shipping docks are exactly 4 miles completely straight ahead of your current physical digital location. Do not attempt to aggressively swerve the car. Do not attempt to violently hit the brake. Do not attempt to completely run away into the shadows. because if you do, I will absolutely make entirely sure you never physically walk as a free man again. I completely muted the live microphone, entirely cutting off his loud, frantic, desperate sobbing. I stared completely straight ahead through my clear glass windshield, watching the massive rusted metal cranes of the southern industrial docks slowly rise up aggressively against the dark orange evening sky. The heavy coastal air was entirely thick with the highly potent smell of stagnant dark water and completely rusted rotting iron. It was the absolute perfect desolate location for the ultimate final confrontation. Julian finally completely understood the absolute terrifying reality of his highly miserable situation. He was entirely no longer the arrogant, wealthy man completely dictating the final terms of my destruction. He was entirely the helpless, bleeding prey, and I was the absolute apex predator, entirely closing in for the final, massive, lethal kill. The heavy tires of my luxury sedan crushed the loose gravel as I pulled into the desolate expanse of the southern industrial docks. The storm had finally broken over Chicago, bringing a torrential, freezing rain that washed over the rusted shipping containers and the cracked asphalt. The entire harbor was abandoned, leaving only the skeletal frames of massive steel cranes towering against the bruised purple night sky. I shifted the car into park and cut the heavy engine. The only sound left in the world was the violent, rhythmic drumming of the freezing rain against the metal roof and the distant, angry churning of the deep harbor waters. I took one final deep breath, filling my lungs with the heavy scent of motor oil, decaying seaweed, and dark ozone. I did not feel any fear. I felt the absolute cold clarity of a highly intelligent woman walking calmly into the final stage of a war she had already won. I pushed the heavy car door open and stepped out into the freezing downpour. The icy rain instantly soaked through my custom-tailored silk blouse and expensive wool trousers, but I did not shiver a single time. I closed the car door behind me and walked slowly toward the dangerous edge of the broken pier. The flickering yellow light of a single broken street lamp cast long, terrifying shadows across the slick concrete, illuminating the final, pathetic battleground. Standing at the absolute edge of the concrete drop-off was the man I had spent 10 years of my life building into a corporate empire. Julian looked absolutely nothing like the highly polished, charismatic chief executive officer who had arrogantly smirked at me in the federal courtroom just a few short days ago. He looked exactly like a wild, cornered, and broken feral animal. His highly expensive custom Italian suit was torn and plastered to his violently shivering frame, ruined by the freezing rain and the thick dark mud from his pathetic cowardly escape through the dirty city alleyways. His handsome face was pale, deeply bruised, and contorted with a highly toxic mixture of raw terror and psychotic, violent rage. In his right hand, he tightly gripped a heavy, rusted, solid steel tire iron, his knuckles white from the sheer physical force of his desperate grip. He held the heavy metal weapon up by his tense shoulder, exactly like a primitive club, ready to violently strike at any sudden, unexpected movement. But it was his left hand that completely captured my immediate focused attention. His violently trembling fingers were pinched incredibly tightly around the delicate platinum chain of my late mother's priceless green emerald antique necklace. He held his long arm outstretched, dangling the bright green heirloom directly over the black freezing waters of the incredibly deep industrial harbor. The violently heavy wind whipped the delicate platinum chain back and forth, physically threatening to tear it from his wet, clumsy fingers and send the absolute only remaining physical piece of my loving mother's beautiful legacy permanently into the unforgiving dark depths. I stopped walking exactly 5 feet away from his violently shaking body, standing completely still in the heavily pouring, freezing rain. The cold water ran rapidly down my face, but I refused to even blink. I stared directly into his wild, bloodshot eyes, refusing to give him the absolute satisfaction of seeing a single ounce of human panic or weakness. "You actually came here, completely alone," he screamed incredibly loudly, his voice completely raw and cracking wildly over the roaring, deafening sound of the violent storm and the aggressively crashing dark waves. He took a heavy, highly aggressive step directly toward me, violently brandishing the heavy, solid steel tire, iron highly threateningly in the cold, dark air. "You finally realized that I am the absolute only one who actually holds all the real power here, Victoria, he shouted. He let out a loud, humorless, and deeply disturbing laugh that echoed highly sharply off the rusted metal shipping containers surrounding us. I want my entire massive life completely back right now. He roared violently, swinging his long arm out over the deep water to aggressively emphasize his highly lethal physical leverage. I want the massive liquid cash completely returned to my primary wealth accounts. I want the highly secure blind trust completely dissolved immediately. I want the total, undisputed ownership of the software company legally and entirely transferred completely back to my own personal name. With a sudden, highly violent, aggressive movement, Julian lunged completely forward and forcefully shoved an incredibly thick stack of heavily wrinkled legal financial documents directly into the center of my cold, wet chest. I had to quickly raise my completely steady hands to catch the thick, heavy paper before it fell into the deep, freezing mud. Sign them right now, he shrieked, incredibly loudly, violently, pressing the cold, heavy, rusted tip of the solid steel iron aggressively directly against the soft, cold, wet skin, entirely on the left side of my unprotected, exposed neck. Sign away your entire fake kingdom completely right now, or I swear to absolute God, I will drop this stupid green antique rock directly into the freezing ocean, and then I will violently and aggressively smash your highly arrogant, entirely cold skull into 1,000 tiny bloody pieces. I slowly looked completely down at the violently crumpled legal transfer papers resting entirely in my wet, steady hands. The heavy freezing rain was entirely already beginning to completely smear the dark black printer ink printed across the thick legal pages. I slowly and calmly reached directly into the dry inside pocket of my damp suit jacket and smoothly pulled out an incredibly heavy solid silver custom fountain pen. The cold, expensive metal of the silver pen felt incredibly solid and completely grounding entirely in my highly steady, firm grip. As I slowly uncapped the silver pen and completely prepared to actually sign my personal name entirely on the exact signature line, he aggressively and violently demanded a vivid, entirely painful memory, suddenly washed completely over my focused mind. I slowly looked completely up from the wet legal paper and stared absolutely deeply into Julian's, a highly terrified, entirely violent, bleeding face. I remember the exact beautiful day we first completely met, Julian. I said, my voice entirely calm, smooth, and absolutely cutting completely through the highly chaotic, loud noise of the violent storm. He blinked rapidly, entirely, clearly, completely confused by my sudden, entirely absolute, total calm demeanor. We were happily sitting at that tiny, highly quiet outdoor cafe right off the busy Michigan Avenue. I continued speaking completely slowly and entirely deliberately as I gently placed the sharp tip of the expensive silver pen entirely onto the thick, wet legal paper. It was a highly beautiful, incredibly warm, sunny spring afternoon. You were completely wearing a highly simple, clean blue button-down cotton shirt, and your dark eyes were incredibly bright and entirely filled with such absolute, genuine, brilliant, positive ambition. You accidentally and entirely clumsily spilled your hot coffee entirely all over my heavy accounting textbooks. You were so incredibly highly embarrassed, and you apologized completely profusely to me. You happily bought me a fresh warm cup of coffee, and you happily sat with me for 3 entire long hours, completely talking about how you entirely wanted to actively build something completely highly meaningful, entirely from the absolute ground up. You completely promised me that exact day that if I entirely helped you completely organize your highly chaotic business ideas, you would entirely spend the rest of your natural life making entirely sure I was completely, absolutely safe and entirely completely protected from the world. Julian completely stared at me, his chest heaving highly violently, his heavy breathing entirely ragged and completely uneven. He slightly and entirely involuntarily lowered the incredibly heavy solid steel tire iron by just a tiny fraction of an inch, entirely completely caught entirely off guard by the highly profound, deeply emotional, sudden memory. You were so incredibly charming and handsome that exact day, Julian, I whispered my voice, entirely carrying a heavy, crushing weight of absolute finality and deep, profound, entirely human disgust. I completely and entirely fell deeply in love with that highly ambitious, entirely kind young man. I completely dedicated my entire beautiful youth, my entire highly brilliant analytical mind, and my entire massive financial family inheritance to actively building a massive, completely entirely secure fortress completely around that exact specific man. I gave you absolutely entirely everything a woman could possibly ever give, but completely looking at you right now, entirely standing here, violently shivering in the freezing dark mud, completely holding my dead mother's highly precious jewelry, entirely hostage over a dark, freezing harbor, exactly like a common, violent, desperate street thug. I finally, entirely, completely understand the absolute terrifying, completely objective truth. That charming, completely ambitious young man never actually entirely existed. He was entirely just a completely hollow, entirely pathetic, entirely fake mask you actively wore to completely entirely drain the bright life and the massive wealth entirely directly out of my trusting soul. You are absolutely not a highly brilliant visionary. You are absolutely not a highly powerful, wealthy chief executive officer. You are entirely just a completely weak, entirely pathetic, highly desperate, entirely completely useless parasite. And a biological parasite completely and entirely dies the exact very second it is violently and aggressively entirely separated completely from its generous host. I completely pushed the incredibly heavy silver pen entirely forcefully directly into the wet, thick paper and calmly signed my personal signature completely and entirely perfectly across the bottom legal line. The dark ink bled entirely slightly into the freezing cold rainwater, but the official legal authorization was entirely and completely clear and entirely valid. I entirely calmly held the heavy, thick stack of completely signed legal documents completely out directly toward his violently shaking, bleeding hands. Julian looked completely down at the highly coveted ink signature, entirely completely verifying the massive legal transfer of total wealth. A dark, highly twisted, entirely completely victorious, arrogant smile slowly and entirely crawled completely across his heavily bruised and entirely bleeding, terrified face. He violently and aggressively snatched the wet legal papers entirely directly out of my steady hands completely, entirely crushing them incredibly tightly, entirely against his ruined, wet chest. He actually entirely had the signature. He honestly, entirely, completely believed he had just completely and absolutely stolen his entire $10 million corporate empire and his massive hidden offshore wealth entirely, completely back from the absolute terrifying brink of absolute total financial destruction. He looked completely up at me and let out an incredibly loud, highly booming, completely arrogant laugh of pure, absolute, total triumph that violently pierced completely entirely through the heavy, freezing, violent rain. You really are absolutely just a completely weak, entirely stupid, completely submissive, boring housewife. After all, Victoria, he mocked incredibly viciously, completely, entirely pocketing the wet signed and papers and highly aggressively stepping completely entirely forward. You honestly entirely completely thought you could completely entirely outsmart me. You entirely completely thought you could entirely and absolutely completely destroy me. But you completely and entirely folded the absolute exact second I aggressively applied a tiny little bit of real violent physical pressure against you. He slowly and highly aggressively raised his entirely wet left hand and entirely looked completely at the incredibly priceless green antique emerald necklace entirely dangling completely from his violently wet, shaking fingers. And the absolute entirely very best complete part is that I absolutely do completely not actually have to ever give this stupid, entirely completely worthless piece of absolute trash completely back to you. He snarled viciously, his dark, wide eyes completely, entirely lighting up with absolute pure, completely, entirely sadistic, violent, entirely, completely lethal intent. Julian completely and forcefully entirely opened his violently trembling wet fingers and highly intentionally, completely dropped my late loving mother's priceless antique emerald necklace. I entirely watched the highly bright green precious stone fall incredibly rapidly, entirely completely through the dark, empty, freezing air, instantly, completely disappearing entirely, and completely, into the incredibly freezing black, violently crashing deep water. Entirely, completely, entirely below us. Entirely. Gone. Completely. Absolutely forever. I absolutely did completely not scream, and I absolutely did entirely not even flinch a single tiny muscle. Julian laughed incredibly loudly, completely, entirely, again, entirely aggressively, raising the incredibly heavy solid steel, completely entirely rusted tire iron, completely entirely high above his wet, completely entirely bleeding head, his thick muscles completely entirely tensing entirely for a highly violent, absolutely lethal, completely aggressive downward physical strike. I completely got exactly entirely what I completely entirely wanted, and now I am entirely completely going to absolutely entirely finish you forever. He roared incredibly violently, entirely bringing the heavy metal completely solid weapon highly aggressively completely down directly and entirely toward my completely unprotected, entirely calm, completely exposed, beautiful face. The heavy rusted tire iron sliced through the freezing Chicago rain, coming straight for my head, with a lethal whistling sound that cut through the roar of the storm. Julian's face was a mask of pure, unadulterated madness, his eyes bulging and his teeth bared in a snarl. He was putting every ounce of his ruined life and his shattered ego into this final violent swing. I did not flinch. I did not even close my eyes. I stood there, as still as a statue, watching the desperation in his bloodshot eyes as the cold metal arc began its descent. Just as the iron was inches from my temple, the entire dark pier was suddenly obliterated by a blinding wall of white light. A dozen high-intensity floodlights erupted from the shadows behind the rusted shipping containers, turning the midnight docks into the middle of a desert at noon. Julian screamed as the sudden glare burned his retinas and his swing faltered. The tire iron hit the concrete with a deafening metallic clang, vibrating against the wet ground as he stumbled backward, clutching his eyes in agony. "Drop the weapon and get on the ground right now." The voice was a thunderclap amplified by a massive bullhorn that made the air itself vibrate. It was the deep, authoritative roar of Marcus, my brother-in-law, stepping into the light with the absolute calm of a man who had already seen the ending of this story. Behind him, a sea of tactical gear moved with military precision. A dozen high-powered rifles with glowing red laser sights converged on Julian's chest, painting him with tiny crimson dots that marked exactly where his heart was beating with frantic cowardice energy. Julian was gasping, his chest heaving, as the freezing rain mixed with the sweat and tears on his face. He scrambled for the tire iron, but the sound of 20 tactical boots hitting the concrete in unison made him freeze. I stepped forward, the water dripping from my hair and soaking my silk blouse, my expression as cold and unforgiving as the iron Julian had tried to use against me. "Did you really think I would walk into a lion's den without making sure the lion was already declawed?" Julian looked at me, his eyes wide with a horrific realization. He reached for the wet envelope in his pocket, the one containing the documents I had just signed under the threat of death. "I have the papers," he shrieked, his voice cracking into a high-pitched, pathetic squeal. "You signed them. The company is mine. The trust is mine. You can't arrest me if I have the legal rights." I let out a soft, chilling laugh that carried over the sound of the heavy rain and the crashing waves against the pier. "Julian, I have spent my entire career as a forensic accountant looking for things that aren't there. Did you honestly believe I would use a standard ballpoint pen to sign away my life to a man who smells like betrayal and cheap cologne? Reach into your pocket, Julian. Look at the paper you are so desperately holding on to as if it is your salvation." Julian frantically pulled out the envelope, his fingers fumbling with the wet seal as the tactical team closed the circle around him. He ripped the documents out, staring at the signature line under the harsh white floodlights. His jaw dropped and a low guttural moan of terror escaped his throat. The paper was as white as a ghost. The signature was gone. The ink had completely vanished, leaving no trace that a pen had ever touched the surface. I loaded that fountain pen with a specific chemical compound of vanishing ink, Julian. It is designed to disappear the moment it hits a certain temperature or moisture level. You were so busy celebrating your fake victory that you did not notice the ink evaporating right in front of your eyes. But that is not the only thing I loaded into that package. I continued, my voice dropping to a steely whisper. Look at the top corner of that envelope. A tiny microscopic light was blinking red against the dark paper, visible only now that the floodlights were positioned just right. Marcus and his team did not find us because of my phone, Julian. They found us because that envelope is embedded with a high-frequency micro-tracker. You led the entire Chicago Police Tactical Unit straight to your own grave because you were too greedy to check the delivery. The absolute weight of his failure hit him all at once. His knees buckled, and he collapsed into the cold, oily puddles on the dock. Before he could even utter another pathetic lie, 2 tactical officers lunged forward. They slammed him face down into the concrete with a bone-jarring thud that echoed through the empty harbor. The tire iron clattered away, sliding across the wet asphalt until it hit the edge of the pier and fell into the dark water below. Julian Reynolds, you are under arrest for felony extortion, grand larceny, and attempted first-degree assault. The officer's voice was like a hammer hitting an anvil. The sound of the heavy steel handcuffs clicking shut around Julian's wrists was the most beautiful music I had ever heard. Julian was weeping now, his face pressed against the wet gravel, the same man who had walked out of court smiling just hours ago. He looked up at me, his eyes filled with a raw primal fear that only the truly guilty can feel. Victoria, please, I was just desperate. I did not mean to hurt you. I looked down at him, not with anger, but with the cold indifference one shows to a discarded piece of trash. You told me women were weak, Julian. You told me I was nothing without your visionary genius. But tonight, you are the one in the dirt, and I am the one standing in the light. Marcus walked up beside me, placing a steady, protective hand on my shoulder. He looked at Julian with a gaze as sharp as a knife, his presence radiating a power that Julian could never dream of possessing. He is done, Victoria. The federal prosecutors already have the offshore ledgers Madison surrendered in the garage. Between the tax evasion, the fraud, and what he just tried to do to you tonight, he will be lucky if he ever sees a sidewalk again. I nodded slowly, watching as they dragged Julian toward the back of a blacked-out transport van. The flashing red and blue lights reflected in the puddles, illuminating the end of my marriage and the beginning of my freedom. Julian's screams of Victoria, please, echoed across the empty harbor, becoming fainter and fainter until the heavy metal doors of the van slammed shut with a final echoing boom. The storm was still raging, the rain coming down in sheets, but for the first time in 10 years, I felt like I could finally breathe. I looked out at the churning black water of the harbor and thought about the lesson I had learned. Karma never misses an address, and it usually arrives exactly when the villain thinks they have finally gotten away with it. Julian thought he had taken everything, but in the end, his own greed was the only thing that followed him into that cold metal cell. I turned my back on the docks, walking toward my car, with the cold, calculating grace of a woman who had won her kingdom back one calculated move at a time. Women can sacrifice, but we should never be foolish. When you are backed into a corner, you do not just survive, you show them your true strength. If you feel satisfied with this ending, please give me a like and subscribe to the channel. It is 3:15 p.m. here in Chicago, where I am finally free. What time is it where you are watching this video, and where are you from? Let me know in the comments below. I want to hear your stories of justice being served. Until next time, stay strong and never let them see you blink. The federal courthouse in Chicago felt like a monolith of cold stone and unforgiving justice today. 6 months had passed since that rain-slicked night at the docks, when the floodlights finally exposed Julian for the predator he truly was. I walked through the security checkpoints with my head held high, wearing a charcoal gray suit that radiated power and a pair of heels that clicked against the marble floors like the ticking of a clock counting down to his final destruction. I pushed open the heavy oak doors of the courtroom, and the air conditioning hit me with a chill that matched the ice in my veins. The room was packed with former investors, employees he had betrayed, and the silent, curious observers of a high-profile fall from grace. I took my seat in the front row and waited for the bailiffs to bring him in. When the side door opened, the room went dead silent. Julian was led out in handcuffs, wearing a shapeless neon-orange jumpsuit that made his sallow skin look like old parchment. He had lost a significant amount of weight, and his once perfectly styled hair was now a patchy mess of dull salt and pepper. He looked aged and broken, as if the reality of his failure had finally begun to rot him from the inside out. He didn't look like a tech visionary anymore. He looked like a small, desperate man who had run out of lies. I felt a visceral surge of boss energy rising in my chest as our eyes met for a fleeting second. He looked away first, and for the first time in 10 years, I knew I held every single card in the deck. The judge, a stern man with eyes like flint, called my name for the victim impact statement. I rose from my chair, smoothed my blazer, and walked toward the witness stand with a grace that felt like a weapon. Every eye in the courtroom was on me. I placed my hand on the Bible and swore the oath, my voice clear and steady. Your Honor. I began looking directly at the judge while Julian stared at the floor. I am here today not just to speak about the $6 million in embezzled funds or the systematic fraud that nearly destroyed 400 lives. I am here to speak about the cost of a decade of silence. For 10 years, I was the architect of Julian Reynolds' success. I was the forensic accountant who built the infrastructure he used to hide his crimes, thinking I was too submissive or too blinded by love to ever look at the books. I watched him divert company capital into offshore shells to finance a life of infidelity and greed, while I worked through the night to keep the company solvent. He treated me like a disposable tool, but he forgot that a tool can also be a key. I am the one who turned the lights on, and I am the one who will make sure they never go out for him again. Julian's defense attorney, a shark named Richard Miller, who specialized in making monsters look like victims, stood up with an aggressive flourish. Mrs. Vance, he said, walking toward me with a sneer, you talk about being an architect, but is it not true that you are actually a vengeful woman who orchestrated this entire downfall because you discovered your husband was leaving you? You are a forensic specialist. You spent months moving assets into a blind trust and flagging accounts for the Internal Revenue Service long before any crime was officially committed. You didn't protect the company, you hijacked it. You lured my client into a financial trap because you were a woman scorned. Is it not true that you intentionally manufactured this criminal case to ensure you would walk away with everything while he was left with nothing? I did not let him finish. I did not raise my voice or show a single flicker of anger. I offered him a cold, sarcastic smile that made him pause mid-stride. Mr. Miller, I said, and the steely power in my voice commanded the entire room. Let us talk about the cold, irrefutable financial logic of your client's business misunderstandings. On June 14th, Julian personally authorized 16 separate wire transfers to a shell company in the Cayman Islands called Redline Logistics. Forensic analysis of the server metadata proves those transfers were made from his personal laptop at 3 in the morning while he was at a hotel in Miami. As the primary financial officer, it was my legal and fiduciary duty under the Sarbanes-Oxley Act to report suspicious activity that lacked a secondary signatory. My actions were not born of revenge, they were mandated by federal law. If your client had spent less time at luxury boutiques with his mistress and more time understanding the compliance handbooks I wrote for him, he would have known that my report was an automated trigger. I did not manufacture a crime, Mr. Miller. I simply refused to be an accomplice to one. The lawyer tried to interrupt, but I spoke over him with the authority of a woman who owned the room. Furthermore, the blind trust you mentioned was established specifically to protect the intellectual property and the payroll accounts of 400 innocent employees from being liquidated to pay for Julian's personal tax evasion. I salvaged the value he tried to burn. If I were the vengeful woman you describe, I would have let the company go bankrupt and watched Julian drown in the debt. Instead, I saved the empire and discarded the parasite. If you think competence is a weapon, then you're exactly right. I am a forensic accountant, Mr. Miller, and the numbers do not have feelings. They only have the truth, and the truth is that your client is a thief. The courtroom remained in a stunned silence as I stepped down from the stand. Julian's lawyer sat down slowly, his face a mottled red of embarrassment. He had tried to badger a wife, and he had been dismantled by a chairman. The judge did not even wait for a recess. He looked down at Julian with absolute disgust. Mr. Reynolds, he said, his voice echoing like a final judgment. Your actions were not just criminal, they were predatory. You used the people who trusted you most as a shield for your own greed. I hereby sentence you to 15 years in federal prison with no possibility of parole and full restitution of all diverted assets. The gavel hit the wooden block with a sound like a gunshot. For a heartbeat, the room was still. Then Julian finally snapped. He lunged out of his chair, knocking over his lawyer's water glass and screaming with a raw guttural fury that chilled the air. "You bitch!" he shrieked as two bailiffs immediately tackled him to the floor. "You think you won? You think you're so smart, Victoria?" His face was purple, and he was thrashing wildly against the officers, his handcuffs clanking against the defense table. "You didn't find it!" he screamed, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. "You missed the Zurich account, the Sapphire Group. I still have $4 million hidden where your little audit could never reach. I will be out in half that time, and I will spend every single cent to find you. I will buy your life, and I will burn it to the ground. I still have the money, Victoria. You failed. I will come for you." The bailiff slammed him face first against the hardwood floor, the orange jumpsuit tightening across his back as they forced his arms into a more secure position. He was still shouting, his voice muffled by the floor, but the venom was unmistakable. I stood up, smoothed my charcoal blazer, and walked slowly toward the side exit where they were dragging him out. I paused for just a second as they pulled him past me. "Julian," I whispered loud enough for only him to hear. "I found the Sapphire Group account 3 months ago. I reported to the federal prosecutors last week, and the Swiss authorities have already frozen the assets. You are going to prison with nothing but the air in your lungs." The look of absolute total soul-crushing defeat on his face was the last thing I saw before the bailiffs dragged him through the door. He began to howl, a sound of pure pathetic brokenness that faded as the heavy steel doors slammed shut behind him. I walked out of the courtroom and into the bright Chicago sunlight. The air felt fresh, and for the first time in a decade, it was mine to breathe. Julian thought he could take everything, but he forgot that the woman who built the house always knows where the secret doors are. I was no longer a victim. I was the victor. Women can sacrifice, but we should never be foolish. When you are backed into a corner, do not just survive, show them your true strength. If you feel satisfied with this ending, please give me a like and subscribe to the channel. It is 4 o'clock here in Chicago and justice has finally been served. What time is it where you are watching this video, and where are you from? Let me know in the comments below. I want to hear your stories of triumph. Until next time, remember that karma never misses an address and the truth always finds the missing zero. The courtroom air was thick with the suffocating scent of old paper and the metallic tang of unspoken fear. The heavy silence of the room was broken only by the ragged and pathetic sobbing of the man who had once been my world. Julian sat slumped at the defense table, his head bowed so low that his chin nearly touched the rough neon orange fabric of his jumpsuit. The judge was preparing to leave the bench, and the bailiffs were already moving forward to haul Julian's broken frame toward the side exit. I stood there perfectly still in my charcoal suit, feeling the cold weight of the victory, but I knew the job was not quite finished. I needed to see the light go out of his eyes completely. I needed him to understand exactly how much of a fool he had truly been before he disappeared into the void of a federal prison. I raised my hand and caught the eye of the lead bailiff, a man who had watched the entire trial and knew exactly who I was. "Your Honor," I said, my voice projecting with a quiet and terrifying authority that made every head in the room turn. "May I have 1 moment to speak with the defendant before he is removed from the court?" The judge looked at me for a long time, his expression unreadable, and then he gave a single slow nod of approval. I walked across the polished hardwood floor, and the sound of my heels felt like a rhythmic execution echoing against the vaulted ceiling. The crowd held its breath as I stepped into the well of the court. Julian was hunched over his orange jumpsuit, wrinkled and stained with his own frantic sweat. He looked like a discarded rag. I leaned down directly into his ear until I could smell the stench of his panic and the salt of his useless tears. I did not raise my voice. I spoke in a whisper so soft it was barely more than a vibration against his skin. "Listen very closely, Julian," I said, and I felt his entire body stiffen as he tried to pull away from my presence. "Do not look away. You spent 10 years thinking I was the silent partner in your life. You thought my quiet nature was a sign of a submissive mind. You thought you were the genius, and I was just the bookkeeper, But the numbers never lie, Julian, and neither do I. I want you to remember every single moment you spent with Madison over the last 2 years. I want you to think about the day you met her in that lobby and how you thought you were the luckiest man alive to have such a beautiful young woman worshipping your every word. You thought you were a visionary who had finally found his queen, but you were just a target in a long game you were never equipped to play. Madison was never your mistress, Julian. She was my employee. I hired her 2 years ago from a high-end corporate intelligence firm the very second I realized you were siphoning company funds to pay for your hidden gambling debts and your shallow ego. She did not fall in love with you. She worked for me. Her entire job, her only mission was to feed your massive, fragile ego until it became a blindfold that prevented you from seeing the trap being built around your feet. I paid her a 6-figure salary to make you feel like a king so that you would become a careless thief. Every expensive dinner you took her to, every luxury hotel room you booked with stolen money was a line item in my personal ledger. She didn't just sleep with you, Julian. She recorded you. She sent me daily reports of your arrogance and your crimes. She was the one who suggested the offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands because I told her to lead you there. She was the one who told you to use the Sapphire Group because she knew my forensic software was already monitoring those specific servers. Every single dollar you stole, every single illicit wire transfer you made was done under my direct and absolute supervision. I didn't just watch you commit these crimes. I paved the road and built the signs to lead you straight to this jumpsuit. I felt his heart pounding against his ribs like a trapped bird hitting the bars of a cage. I continued my voice like a cold surgical blade cutting through his remaining sanity. You think you were the one who wanted the divorce, Julian. You think you were the brave one who decided to walk away and start a new life with a younger woman. Madison was the one who pressured you to file those papers. She was the one who told you to fight for the house and the company because I needed you to legally claim those assets before the federal audit triggered. I needed you to claim ownership so that the liability would fall solely on your shoulders. I needed you to sign those papers to solidify your own destruction. She played her part perfectly, and she is currently sitting in a private villa in the Mediterranean with a very generous bonus I paid her this morning. You sacrificed your marriage, your reputation, and your freedom for a woman who was reporting your every movement to me every single night. You were never in control. You were a puppet, and I was the one pulling the strings while you danced in your Italian suits. And about that hidden account in Zurich, Julianne, the one you just screamed about in front of the judge like a desperate animal, the Sapphire Group account that you thought was your final golden ticket to freedom. You were right when you said my audit didn't find it during the trial. I didn't need an audit to find a ghost account that I created for you. I was the one who leaked the details of the Sapphire Group to your burner phone. I knew your greed would make you take the bait. I watched you move $4 million into that account yesterday morning, thinking you were being clever and sneaky. I waited until you were in the back of that transport van, and then I used the master administrative keys to drain every single cent. That money is no longer in Switzerland, Julian. It was transferred into the Vance Legacy Foundation 2 hours ago. It is currently being used to fund a scholarship for women in forensic accounting so that they can learn how to catch men exactly like you. You are going to a federal cell with nothing but the orange clothes on your back. You have no money left in this world. You have no mistress waiting for you. You have no friends because you betrayed them all. You are a zero, Julian. A perfect, absolute, and permanent zero. I pulled back and looked at him. I watched the realization wash over his face in slow motion waves of absolute mind-shattering horror. His eyes widened until the whites were visible all around the iris, and his pupils shrunk to pinpricks. He stopped breathing. The ragged sobbing ended abruptly and was replaced by a hollow rattling sound in his chest. His brain was physically breaking as he tried to reconcile the man he thought he was with the pathetic pawn he actually was. He tried to speak, to scream, to curse me, but his voice was completely gone. His jaw worked silently like a fish out of water as he looked at me, and then his legs simply gave out. He collapsed to his knees on the courtroom floor, a heap of orange fabric and broken dreams. He didn't move. He didn't blink. He just stared at the floor with the 1,000-yard stare of a man who had been erased from his own life. The bailiffs had to physically lift his dead weight to carry him out, because he no longer had the will to stand. He was completely catatonic. I turned my back on the wreckage of his life and walked away through the heavy oak doors. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. The numbers were finally balanced and the account was closed forever. Women can sacrifice, but we should never be foolish. When you are backed into a corner, do not just survive. Show them your true strength. If you feel satisfied with this ending, please give me a like and subscribe to the channel. It is now 5 o'clock in Chicago, and I'm starting my life over with a clean slate. What time is it where you are watching this video, and where are you from? Let me know in the comments below. I want to hear your thoughts on this ultimate payoff. Until next time, remember that the truth always finds the missing zero, and justice is a dish best served with absolute precision. Would you like me to generate a final summary of the assets Victoria recovered? Or should we move on to the next chapter of her life? I watched the heavy steel doors close behind Julian as the bailiffs dragged his limp, catatonic body into the shadows of the holding cells. The man who had once occupied every corner of my heart was now nothing more than a ghost in a neon orange jumpsuit. The courtroom began to empty around me, the murmurs of the crowd fading into a distant hum that I no longer felt the need to listen to. I stood in the center of that vast room alone, but for the first time in 10 years, I was not lonely. I was whole. I felt the cold weight of the forensic evidence files in my hand, and I set them down on the mahogany table for the very last time. I was done with the numbers. I was done with the lies. I was done with the broken memory of Julian Reynolds. I looked at the spot where he had just collapsed, and I felt a profound stillness settle over my spirit. The long game was finally over. The ledgers were closed, and the accounts were balanced with a precision that only justice can provide. I gathered my things with a slow, deliberate grace, not out of habit, but out of a new sense of absolute peace. My lawyer approached me and shook my hand, his eyes filled with a respect that was no longer just professional, but deeply personal. "We did it, Victoria," he said softly. I simply nodded because I knew that we had done more than just win a case. We had restored the truth. I turned my back on the judge's bench and walked toward the exit. Every step I took away from that witness stand felt like a physical weight being lifted from my weary shoulders. I pushed open the massive double oak doors of the courtroom, and the heavy thud behind me sounded like the final period at the end of a very long and very dark sentence. I walked through the grand hallway of the courthouse, seeing the light reflecting off the marble floors. I passed the people who had once doubted me and the investors who had once overlooked me, but I didn't see them. I only saw the path ahead. I reached the heavy glass doors that led to the street, and I paused for just a second to breathe in the quiet before the world saw my face. I pushed through the doors and stepped out onto the top of the grand stone stairs. The Chicago sun was blindingly bright, reflected off the glass of the skyscrapers and the silver surface of the river. It was a beautiful, cloudless afternoon, and the warmth of the light hit my face like a physical embrace. I took a deep, ragged breath of the fresh city air, and it didn't taste like the stagnant atmosphere of the courtroom or the metallic scent of a prison cell. It tasted like a clean slate. I stood there at the top of the stairs and closed my eyes, letting the sunlight soak into my bones. I felt the tension that had lived in my jaw and my shoulders for a decade finally dissolve into the warm spring wind. I was Victoria Vance, and for the first time in my life, I didn't belong to a company or a husband or a legacy. I belonged to myself. The sounds of the city, the honking of the cars, the chatter of the tourists, and the distant roar of the train felt like a symphony composed specifically for my arrival. I opened my eyes and looked out at the skyline, a horizon that I had helped build, and one that I now owned in a way that Julian could never understand. Down at the curb, a sleek black sedan was waiting, its polished surface gleaming in the sun. Marcus was leaning against the passenger door, his charcoal suit jacket unbuttoned, and his arms crossed in that characteristic pose of quiet strength. Beside him stood my sister Jessica, and the moment she saw me, her face broke into a radiant smile that mirrored my own. She was holding a leather leash, and Cooper, the golden retriever, was sitting at her feet, his tail thumping a happy rhythm against the pavement as he looked up at me with pure, unconditional love. I walked down the stone stairs toward them, my stride long and confident. When I reached the bottom, Jessica threw her arms around me, and we held each other for a long time. She didn't say anything because she didn't have to. We had survived the fire together. Marcus stepped forward and placed a heavy, grounding hand on my shoulder. He gave me a sharp nod of respect, the kind of look one soldier gives another when the battle is finally won and the territory is secured. He opened the car door for me, and I saw my reflection in the window. I didn't see the sacrificial wife or the submissive partner. I saw the victor. I saw the woman who had played the long game with the patience of a predator and the precision of a surgeon. As I sat in the car, I looked back at the courthouse building one last time. Its tall stone pillars stood like silent witnesses to the truth we had uncovered. Julian had spent years underestimating the woman he shared a bed with. He thought my silence was a sign of a submissive mind. He thought my sacrifices were a weakness he could exploit to fund his own greedy delusions and his faithless nights. He never realized that while I was building his company, I was also building his prison. I knew every account, every password, and every dark secret he thought he had hidden from the light. I had turned his own greed into the very weapon that dismantled his life. I looked at the shimmering Chicago skyline and realized that I didn't just have my money back. I had my soul back. I was the architect of my own destiny, and this time I was building a kingdom that no man could ever tear down. I looked directly at the world as if I were looking into the eyes of every person who has ever been told they are not enough. They think our silence is submission. They think our love makes us blind. But when a woman builds a kingdom, she knows exactly where to place the explosives. Justice has been served, and the dawn is finally here. If you loved seeing Julian lose his mind and finally get what he deserved, smash that like button and subscribe to the channel right now. It is exactly 4 o'clock here in Chicago, and the world has never looked brighter or more full of hope. What time is it where you are watching this video? And where are you from? Let me know in the comments below, because I want to celebrate this victory with all of you. Until next time, stay strong, stay smart, and never let anyone mistake your kindness for a lack of a plan. The story is just beginning, and the future belongs to those who have the courage to take it. Goodbye for now, and I will see you in the next one.